know, that should be,
Should never
I
come
should
early.
never come early, seriously. That should have been.
God, I really forget everything. As long as you read your brief verbatim, you'll be okay.
Right? That's right. That's right. Yeah, the one class would actually do briefs.
Is Trish stuck because of the accident?
Perfect. Hello, good evening. Hello. Welcome back. Okay, we're waiting on one more, so we'll give it a couple minutes.
First time early.
She is coming to that, right?
You know what, I've always heard about it, but because I've never seen it.
You got your pen.
I've never seen that, yeah.
Makes me happy. It's a little thing in life.
Pen?
Yeah. All metal. Well, actually, I think top's still plastic.
Oh, those are German ones?
Which one?
The German pen?
Tool?
Oh, I know what you're talking about, but not with those.
But this is a new one that they just came out with. I looked at the price and I was like, yeah, it's a pen.
Your little sleepy friend over here.
Uh-huh.
She has quite the selection of pens.
Yes?
Yes.
What kind of pens do you like?
I like the Japanese ones, they're like extra fine point,
Oh,
like
they're the best.
0.3.
Oh, see, I hate extra fine. I like a good
It's just like
0.7, gives a
Or
good
I
nice
have like
full line.
they're like the German like marker pens.
Uh-huh.
I love those.
I do like that it's metal and that it's got a metal tip because when I went through the police academy, they told us always keep a clicker pen because if you had to use it as a weapon, you could. With a pen cap, you'd have to pop up the pen cap and use it if you had to, so. Yeah.
Why would I do?
Are we all taking a name from the Seven Dwarfs or what?
What are you?
Well, he's halfway done with coffee, so not grumpy. There you go. Happy, sleepy. I had dopey on the side of my chair box in high school because I was a little like not street smart. Okay. All right, everybody's here. Would somebody mind grabbing the door there? What's that? Oh, we do have a board. I think it was in here last week as well. Or not last week, 2 weeks ago.
This one?
Yeah. Okay, so I love doing the easements approach because it's very structured. You should love easements as well because it's very structured. And it's not so much a fill-in, but you can kind of go down the list.
Okay.
And I'm not wearing very structured clothing. Okay. Ooh, I don't know what that says. Somebody died. No.
It's gotta be Wills and Tress.
I don't think they're in this room.
He was here yesterday.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, too bad. So sad. Goodbye. One of the people here died anyway, so sure we can move on.
That was CJ.
Oh,
That's
that
it.
was
Oh, that would make
CJ.
CJ on our multi.
There you go. Mystery solved.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm gonna just give you an overview of easements first, then we're gonna walk through with some cases, okay? So I want you to be able to apply the approach when we're going through these cases. As a practical matter, an easement is going to be the grant of a non-possessory property interest that entitles its holder to some form of use or enjoyment of another's land that land that is providing that use or enjoyment is called the servient tenement. Makes sense. They are being of service, right? So really kind of have to step back and just look at the verbiage that we have in that rule. It's a non-possessory interest, right? So this is not an ownership, this is not a possessory interest, this is a use interest. Okay, this is you can use or not do something. So the grant of a non-possessory property interest that entitles its holder to some form of use or enjoyment of another's land called a servient tenement. So when managing an easements approach, I'm sure you can understand. I'm gonna hit this with my top folder. We have easement. Then you want to give rule, right? So we just talked about the rule. Then it's a bit different than some of the other approaches because you're going to identify, it's almost going to be a chronology of the easement. Does that make sense? Well, not until I tell you the rest of it, right? You're like, oh yeah, sure, whatever you say. Okay, so the general, everybody's like, yeah. And then I was like, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But I appreciate the support. Okay. So,
We're here for you.
right, there you go. As long as we can keep her awake. All right. So, hey, I didn't bring it up tonight. So she looked at you, death stare. Okay, so it's going to really be the chronology of the easement, the life of the easement, okay? So we start with the creation of an easement. So after you go easement rule, then you're going to have a header for, God, I'm going to do this all night, sorry. You're going to go creation, okay? Under creation, you're going to then talk about effectively the identifying characteristics of the easement. There are different ways that you can create an easement. So under creation, you're going to talk about whether the easement is affirmative or negative. I can at least understand why the cuff would be touching this, but the funny one was when I swiped around and my hair hit it and it drew on it. Okay, it can be affirmative or negative. Now, there are 4 ways to create an affirmative easement, okay? That is, can either be by, you would describe it as ping or pine. I'm a ping, he's a pine, okay? So it's prescriptive, implied, necessity, or grant if you're using ping. If you're using pine, it's express. So a grant easement and an express easement are the same thing, okay? So we'll walk through each one of them, so don't be too confused, okay? Beginning with the first, a prescriptive easement. You all are going to really appreciate this because you've already learned it for the most part. This has the same elements as what?
Adverse possession.
As adverse possession, with what exception?
That is not.
Continue for 20 years?
Yeah.
No,
No, it's not.
It's not,
it's kind of a quasi element.
It's not
Well-
possession, I guess.
No. So let's think about this. Well,
hostile.
it could be.
It's known to the owner.
Somebody said it. It's not exclusive, right? Why? Because you're giving the interest to the other, well, that's not necessarily true, right? Because this is by prescription, it's with hostile, with the hostile component. However, it's not exclusive use of the property, right? The other people still have ownership, possession. You're just maybe continuing to use something. Perhaps you're using a road across the way and they're still in ownership. Maybe they live on the property. Okay? So there is no exclusivity, and we just have to be mindful of that. So an easement may be acquired by satisfying the elements of adverse possession. Okay? That's a prescriptive easement. Continuous for the statutory period, open and notorious, actual use, and hostile use with the servient owner's consent. Or without the servient owner's consent. That wouldn't make sense otherwise, would it? So that's COA if you're Fleming's person, it's Hoak if you're a Barbary person, right? I can still acknowledge that Fleming's exists, I just don't use it. Okay. It's like acknowledging the other party in the case, but knowing that you're going to disagree with their argument in most cases. All right. Permission would defeat the acquisition of an easement by prescription, and easement by prescription requires the use be hostile. So you guys already really know that one. You're going to be able to pick that one out a mile away, right? Okay, so now let's go on to the new information that we haven't seen before. An easement by implication. The court may imply an easement if two things exist, okay? The first of which, the previous use was apparent. Not like of a child, but obvious. Everybody's too focused. Okay. All right. The court may imply an easement if the previous use was apparent and she's still kind of with that. Okay. So this is what I call an and rule, not an or rule, right? You know how we have some of those or rules where it's two of the three, you know, this, or this. This is an and rule. You must have both elements, okay? So it's and the parties expected that the use would survive division because it is reasonably necessary to the dominant land's use and enjoyment. Makes sense, and we'll see that in some cases. So it was, previous use was apparent, and the parties expected for it to live on. Why? Because it was reasonably necessary for the use and enjoyment of the dominant tenement. So we're starting to use this language, right? We've got the servient tenement, that's the one that's servicing the easement, and then we've got the dominant tenement, which is probably what? Benefiting from the easement, right? That would require two pieces of land. Now, I used this example last year because it made sense, and it probably still makes sense. Anybody seen 50 Shades?
Oh, great.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Read it? Seen it? Lies. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Well, then I won't use that example. But there's a dominant person and a servient person, and
See where you go.
understand the analogy now. Okay, so we guess we're just keeping it PG here, not PG-13 or R. Or I guess it's quasi PG-13. All right, so we're going to start using this language, and we'll identify that more as we identify the next characteristic of easement. So we're still in affirmative or negative. When we get to a pertinent and engross, then we're going to talk about that. Let's move on to the next affirmative easement. That's going to be an easement by necessity. Now, an easement by necessity has a very distinct traditional example. That is a landlocked setting. You guys know what that means? I'm going to show you what that means. Here is the classic example. Okay? Dominant, servient. Why? Because I have to get off the property in one direction, right? What's the thing they always say?
Get a helicopter.
Right. Is your property big enough for a helipad? That is not required. Can you build a bridge? Not required, okay? So you should be able to get off the property in one of these directions. Now, chances are it's going to be in whatever the shortest distance is. However, one of the other factors that you have to consider is, well, what if there's a mountain range over here? Okay? What if there is water over here? That looks just like the mountain range, doesn't it? Okay. All right. I was going to go with a little swirly wave, and then I was like,
I would put a dolphin in there.
Here, we'll do the little seagulls. That looks like a wave. So, all right. Well, I wasn't the art major. Professor Drucker was. Okay.
I'll draw your exam if we do.
Right. So they're gonna be like, everything looks the same. The key is gonna look all the same. Okay. So if that's the case, then you would presumably be able to go in one of the other directions. Okay. If the road is down here, all right, watch for it. Different. I mean, it started getting a little swirly there, but okay. Then you might have access in a different direction. Okay. So this is your traditional necessity requirement. The landlocked setting and easement of right-of-way will be implied by necessity if grantor conveys a portion of his land with no way out except over part of the grantor's remaining land, right? So consider this all used to be one piece of property. Then they sold this 5 acres in the middle, okay? They have to afford the people some way to get off the property. Now that being said, in doing so, as we get to the end of the life of an easement by necessity, we'll have to talk about how that can end and whether or not it can be revived, okay? I've got a good example now. Think of this. Can an easement by, you don't have to write this one down because you're just gonna laugh. You're going to laugh. Just kidding. Okay. So an easement by necessity is not a zombie. It believes in reincarnation. Hold on to that for when we get to termination. It'll make more sense. Okay.
This is going to.
I know. Okay, so easement by grant, this is the last one we have, okay? An easement to endure for more than 1 year must be what? Written. Why? Satisfy the statute of frauds. So, and it must comply with the formal elements of a deed. The writing to evidence the easement is called a deed of easement. So, it effectively looks like a grant deed. I know we haven't done deeds yet, but it's going to have to be some document in writing that conveys the non-possessory interest for use of the easement. Now you understand why I call it a grant deed and Professor Drucker would call it an express easement, because you have to expressly communicate in writing what it is. Or if it's not in writing, it can, I suppose it can be an oral express grant or an oral express easement, but I think that you are creating a problem for yourself. One, because you want to be very explicit about what the terms are. And two, it really should follow the formal elements of a deed, which I believe requires a writing.
Well, that's the problem is, well, I mean, as a practical matter, what would happen if you had an oral easement like that is that what would happen is it would run until the statutory period was over. Then it would be out of the statute of frauds because the transaction would be finished. And you might have it by prescription, but then the problem is that it really wasn't hostile. So you're going to run into trouble. That's why people don't do that. You know, it's very problematic at that point.
So it really needs to be in writing.
So it
If
really
you ever
should
advise
be.
anybody, it needs to be in writing. So those are our 4 affirmative easements, okay? So now we're going to transition into the negative, okay? The negative easement does what? If an affirmative easement allows the easement holder to do something, what do you think the negative easement?
Prevents you from doing something.
Right. It effectively, the negative easement entitles its holder to prevent the servient landowner from doing something that would otherwise be permissible. Now, there are really 4 at common law, and then there's a 5th in a minority of jurisdictions. Why do you think that is? Well, let's talk about what the 4 are first. Negative easements are generally recognized in 4 categories: light, air, support, and stream water from an artificial flow. That's light, air, support, and stream water from an artificial flow. What do you think the 5th is?
I think modern.
Mountains?
Interesting you say that.
That is an interesting one, actually. It's close.
Scenic view.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's in a majority of jurisdictions?
Like those beach fronts?
Coastal areas, right? Here, I'm gonna throw out a little Real Housewives of Orange County there for you. Anybody? No? Just me? The rest of you? No. Homework. could help your grade. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, participation. So, Real Housewives of Orange County, right? You've got the Dubrows, right? Heather and Terry Dubrow. He's a very successful surgeon. She was an actress for a hot second, and yeah, actress. She appeared on a few things. So, they have a house on the coast in Orange County in a very exclusive neighborhood. They built it out. They built it out and they also at a certain elevation. Do you think that their property value would diminish if somebody built a larger house in front of them and cut off their view of the ocean? You best believe it, by like millions of dollars, okay? So they likely would have some type of easement that would be a negative easement regarding the scenic view that the other person would be prevented from building up and affect their scenic view, right? So any woman who has a champagne doorbell thing or button in her closet is probably picking the location for a reason, right? They're a little over the top, okay? So scenic view is huge for people. It's the reason we said, oh, when you said mountain view was because we've always used coastal properties, but I suppose if there was like a really beautiful, you know, view or scenic view for a mountain range or something like that, then it might create, it might create the same situation. So that's why it's a minority of jurisdictions. Because, you know, if you go to the Midwest, everything's flat, right? So you're like, well, am I just not supposed to build? Because I'm going to be in your way, right? So that's something to be mindful of as well. So those are our 5. Negative easements can only be created how? Expressly, okay? By writing, signed by the grantor. There is no natural or automatic right to a negative easement. This must be done by grant or expressly written. Okay, so that is our first characteristic that we have to identify in our under creation. Is it affirmative or is it negative? The next that we need to identify is it appurtenant or engross? So, an appurtenant easement requires how many pieces of land? 2, absolutely. That is the servient tenement and the dominant tenement. And we've already identified what those are, but let's just do that one more time. An easement appurtenant when it benefits its holder in his physical use or enjoyment of his property. It takes 2 parcels of land to be involved. This is what you would put into your rule, okay? For easement appurtenant takes 2 parcels of land, a dominant tenement, and I know this seems ridiculous, but these are gimme points, okay? Tell me what a dominant and a servient tenement are. Don't just say a dominant and a servient tenement and assume that I know that. Give me the description. A dominant tenement which derives the benefit of the easement, and a servient tenement which bears the burden of the easement. Can you have an easement appurtenant with only 1 parcel of land? Everybody?
No.
No, absolutely not. 1 piece of land cannot be both the dominant and the servient tenement. Okay, so the alternative is an easement engross. An easement engross, if it confers upon its holder only some personal or pecuniary advantage that is not related to its use or enjoyment of the land, the servient land is burdened. However, there is no benefited or dominant tenement. So you only have a servient tenement in an easement engross because there is 1 piece of land that you are allowing somebody to come upon or use for pecuniary interest. Does everybody know what pecuniary interest is?
No.
like a financial interest, okay?
Lots of money.
So, let's talk about the transferability of an easement, okay? A pertinent easement passes automatically with the dominant tenement regardless of whether it's even mentioned in the conveyance.
That's true.
Does that make sense to everybody? An easement appurtenant, we've got a dominant and a servient tenement. It passes automatically with the dominant tenement, even if it's not mentioned in the conveyance. Now, interestingly, what you would find is a circumstance in which it wasn't mentioned, but perhaps the dominant tenement was sold for less than what it normally would have been sold for. And a reasonable person would probably have to say, gee, I wonder why that is. And why that is probably because there's an easement on the property. Otherwise, if it was sole use, possession, and ownership, it would probably be valued higher. Okay? So, that being said, the burden of the easement appurtenant also passes automatically with the servient estate unless the new owner was what? One of Professor Drucker's favorite things. It's like you don't know us at all. A bona fide purchaser, right?
You know, I say like 7 things a year. I'm kind of surprised.
Cave, aerolite,
I thought cave.
bona fide purchaser. That's it. That's it. Texas, get, like, come on,
No matter how many words you can do it in, I can do it in less.
you know?
That's my line.
You don't know us at all. All right, so the burden of the easement appurtenant also passes automatically with the servient estate unless the new owner is a bona fide purchaser. Why? Because they don't know.
They haven't noticed.
They don't know. So the dominant tenement is going to be benefited in some way, and I gave you that example backwards when I said it. The dominant tenement may have been valued at less without the easement because they are bearing the benefit of the servient tenement. We get to drive across their property, so you don't just have a landlocked situation that is worth nothing because nobody can get there or get off. Make sense? No, not complete. You're just nodding your head yes because I was doing it, right?
No.
Okay. So let me give this to you again. This is the dominant tenement. This is the servient tenement. Why?
Because the dominant is the one that benefits from the easement because they can get off the property
By doing what?
by driving across or whatever.
Driving across what?
The servient.
The servient tenement. So what they're saying is it automatically transfers with them, right? But on the servient tenement, it only transfers with them if they are a bona fide purchaser. What would thwart this person from saying, you can't use my property to get across in this scenario? So it's paid valuable consideration without notice. We have 3 types of notice. What are they? Oh, you're killing me here, folks. There was not enough tryptophan in that turkey to make you forget the 3 types of notice. Give me one.
Express notice?
Not even one. I mean, kind of, but no. Air. Actual inquiry record. If there is a piece of property in the middle of your property that you completely encompass, don't you have actual notice that that exists? Have you seen it with your eyes? Have you been notified that it exists? Can you have inquiry notice that if you just like walked around and said, hey, that's weird, why is that thing there? Oh, hey, there's a property within your property. And record notice, you could probably go and check title, the fact that this used to all be one property, and then it changed. You could probably arguably show all three types of notice in this situation. So can you be a bona fide purchaser of this property and say, I wouldn't be burdened as a servient tenement? Because it doesn't automatically pass, it just has to be without them being a bona fide purchaser. Or they would have to be a bona fide purchaser for it not to pass.
Okay. You've lost me entirely.
Okay, so it naturally passes with the dominant tenement. It does not naturally pass with the servient tenement unless, right? Unless they are on notice.
Unless they're on notice, yeah.
You would have to be a bona fide purchaser. How can you argue that that person A is a bona fide purchaser in this circumstance? They probably paid valuable consideration, that they've got, right? How do you argue that this person does not have notice that this exists?
Well, you can't because,
Precisely,
yes, okay.
okay? Which means in this circumstance, I don't think you could ever reasonably argue that A is not on some notice, which means they cannot meet the second element. Oh, maybe you think of one.
One area,
Uh-huh.
that's kind of why we have it, fraud. If they take
Fair
steps to keep it.
Conceal it.
Then you can be a bona fide.
Yeah, if they took steps to conceal the other property, then fine.
For sure,
But if not,
but that's about it, yeah.
then there's no way that you could say, I didn't have notice that this like 5-acre piece of property was in the middle and that it wasn't mine.
So,
Yeah, if they tried to conceal it in some way or
If
create
they
a fraud.
if they commit fraud, then you're gonna be okay. The bona fide purchaser, and people do. You know, they go out there and they cover over these easement, the little roads and things.
Well, not just that, but if they, I could see that if they were committing a fraud to do that, and then also, I think though, if the person purchasing did a title search, they would be able to see that the property's description changed. So I think it would be difficult, even with a fraud, to not notice in the chain of title that the property used to be 5 acres larger. Or that the description would have been, you know, here, less this piece out of the center. Does that make sense? You guys know what a title search is? Okay, so when you go back and you look at the record of title, it would otherwise change the description of the land. Okay? So I think it would be hard, even if you were committing a fraud, to do that, but I suppose it could happen. People are sneaky. All right, so the next big header that you're gonna have,
Interesting.
because this is the first one, right? Creation. The next one is going to be, and I'm just going to erase all of this because I had a lot more room when we used the formal whiteboard. And I used to be able to fit this all very tight, but fit it all on one screen. And I don't think I can do that here.
I can't do it in Congo.
Nope. All right, so now we've got 2, scope. Okay? How many people think this is where you get all your points? Yeah? You would be mistaken. Okay, but there's one time where you could potentially get a lot of points in this area. These are not points that you want to lose, these are giving points again. Scope. The scope of an easement is determined by the terms or condition that it created. So what that effectively says, and what you're probably going to put under your scope section is, or are, the words of the easement. So if they say the entire length of the west end of our property and 20 feet wide from the property line inward, and they made a road there, those are going to be the words of the easement. that we allow use for travel for ingress and egress off the property or through the property along the west side or 20 feet from the property line into the property for a roadway. That would be the language of the easement. Now, what is the one area where that becomes a discussion? Anybody have a guess? By the way, don't lose those points. You literally just have to recite, this is the scope of the easement. The easement affords blah, 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 blah. What's the one area where you'd have a discussion there? Anybody have a guess?
If it was oral,
No?
if it changes.
How?
Shrubbery, fence, or something built on there?
That's gonna be more in, I think, a termination issue.
By conveyance, if the land is conveyed.
No.
I like what Trish said so far. That's
I
the
know.
closest. Yeah.
What if it unilaterally changed? Let me give you an example. What if they say, we allow you the use of this easement, and all of a sudden now, I think I used the bed and breakfast example before. Okay, so you've got a private residence and you were using this road to go to and from the private residence, right? Okay, remember my example that was up there, landlocked, okay? Then you decide to turn your very, very beautiful large private residence at the end of the road here into a bed and breakfast. Now you've got, or a little inn, right? All of a sudden I just thought Gilmore Girls, right? No, anybody? Okay. Trying to give all the references here, nobody's biting. Okay, I like aged myself away from I Love Lucy, so now you gotta come up with different references, right? So if you now have husband and wife who had children and now all their children have moved away, so they decided to own or open a bed and breakfast or a small inn, who else is gonna be coming to the property? Right, guests, what else? Vendors, deliveries, right? You're gonna have all visitors, you're gonna have all those people coming. So now this road that was literally the road less traveled, it was just mom and dad and the kids whenever they came to visit, now has got people coming every day, coming and going, because they're gonna go out to the sites and then they're gonna come back and then they're gonna leave to go to dinner and then they're gonna come back, right? Then Uber is gonna show up to pick somebody up. So there's a ton of traffic all of a sudden. Now you are exceeding the scope of the use, okay? So if you are exceeding the scope, that now creates a problem.
Yeah, because you can use an easement for different things. It can change, no problem. But if you exceed the scope, that's where it really becomes a problem.
So now what if the dirt road is getting all banged up and they decide, well, we're gonna throw gravel down? Was that something that was part of the agreement? Or we're going to pave it?
That's always good.
That's pretty significant, right? Okay. So now we've got the first two sections of an easement. We're gonna go to the last. What do you think that is? If you're telling a story, you've got a beginning, a middle,
Ending, termination.
termination, right? Okay, so we've got termination. And for this one, we're gonna use end cramp, okay? The first of which is estoppel. Second of which is necessity. Destruction. Of servient tenement. Condemnation of servient tenement. I forgot one. Oh, the release. Abandonment. my personal favorite, merger and prescription. Now it's a little bizarre because you see two of the ways you can create as two of the ways you can end, right? So we've got an easement and we've got estoppel. The servient owner if the servient owner materially changes his or her position in reasonable reliance on the easement holder's assurances that the easement will not be enforced. Okay? Does everybody understand that? Okay. That's pretty self-explanatory in terms of estoppel, right? If I change my position because you're not going to enforce the easement, then it has terminated. Necessity. What do you think that one is? And this is where I'm going to go back to my zombie versus reincarnation.
That's the only way they can get to their.
So let me give you, right, let me give you this example. Landlocked situation. Here's my property. This is mountains. It's not a mountain. But they have now taken down a hole in the mountain and created a tunnel. That's literally my Roger Rabbit tunnel. It's a terrible tunnel. But now you've got a tunnel that you can go through. So let's say your property goes through here, okay? I can go through the tunnel. Do I still have a necessity to cross over other areas of their property? No, because the necessity has effectively ended. So now the easement ends. So this is why I ask you, is an easement by necessity a zombie, or must it be reincarnated as something different? $50-50 chance. Anybody want to take a chance?
It's gotta be reincarnated.
Correct. Why? Because we already got to the end of the story, right? The end. It does not just come back to life and exist again. You have to reincarnate that thing, go all the way back to the front, and start, because what happened to the tunnel? Well, it collapsed because it was poor structure. And now they can't get over the mountain. You're not going to Sherpa that thing over the mountain. That is not required. Okay? So now they have to let you get off the property in some other way. You have to start fresh as a new easement by necessity. That would require you to go back up to creation, and what you would probably do as a practical matter for an exam is say easement number 1, then easement number 2, and then you'd go affirmative. So under creation, you'd say affirmative, easement by necessity. What you would say is there are 2 ways to create easements, or 2 types of easements, affirmative or negative. Then you would say that this is an affirmative easement. There are 4 types of affirmative easements. Now, am I going to require you to give me the rule of all 4 affirmative easements? Absolutely not. What I do want to see is there are 4 types of affirmative easements: prescriptive, implied, necessity, and grant. Then you're going to give me a header for necessity. Then you're going to give the rule for necessity. Then you're going to say here, and then do your analysis. Therefore, an easement by necessity has been created. Then you're going to talk about whether it's an easement in gross or appurtenant. In this case, easement in gross or appurtenant. This is an easy one. Somebody's got to know that this is an easement appurtenant. Why?
Because there's 2.
Because there's 2 parcels. You can't have an easement in gross with more than 1 parcel. And you must have at least 2 to have an easement appurtenant. So now we've identified easement appurtenant. Then what are you going to do after that? Well, before you get scope. If it's an easement appurtenant, you're not going to forget to identify the servient and the dominant tenement. Easy points. And I purposely asked it that way because everybody misses that, and they're easy points. Then what are you going to do? Throw it at me one more time. Scope. You're going to give your scope information, and seeing no bed and breakfast made, we're going to assume that it is not a scope issue. You're going to talk about the scope. No issues under scope seem to be present. Then you're going to move into termination. Well, if it still exists, you're going to say, it does not meet any of the criteria of termination of the easement, therefore, there's a continuing easement. How could it end aside from necessity? How could this easement end aside from necessity? Well, you'll find out shortly, okay? The next one, so after necessity, we've got destruction of the servient tenement. Now, destruction of the servient tenement and condemnation of the servient tenement seem to give people a little bit of confusion because they seem very similar to people by way of the description, or by way of the name. Destruction of the servient tenement, other than through the willful conduct of the servient owner, the servient tenement is destroyed. Okay? So, if, I suppose this is a good example, or very, very present example, we've just had a very significant fire in California. That could be a destruction of the servient tenement. If you were in a wooded area and you were able to get to the main road by going across your neighbor's land, and that has now been burned down, and the road is now not able to be traveled, that is a destruction of the servient tenement, and that ended the easement effectively. It terminated the easement. They can't get across the easement at this point, okay? But that was not by any willful conduct of that party. Now, if the party committed an arson and it burned down, and it was through their criminal conduct or their willful conduct that the easement was ended or terminated, then I suppose you'd have an action against them. So, condemnation of the servient estate. When you condemn something that is different than destroying something, condemnation is going to fall in the category of eminent domain. Okay? By eminent domain, this will end the easement. What does that mean? That means that the government has come in and taken over the property, and the government does not have an obligation to be saddled with an easement from the prior landholder or landowner. So when you think condemnation, that should really be an example of eminent domain. The government has come and taken the property. Okay? The R is going to be for release. This one's pretty self-explanatory. A written release, not an oral release, a written release given by easement holder to the servient owner. So the dominant tenement or the person who is benefiting by an easement in gross is going to give written release of their use of the easement to the servient tenement, who's hoping for a release. No? Everybody's still typing. I know. If you have a third hand, then you could have raised your hand, but we, at least in this class, only have two. All right. Now we have A for abandonment. The easement holder must demonstrate by physical action the intent to never use the easement again. Abandonment requires physical action by the easement holder. Now, somebody brought up one of the ways that you can do an easement by abandonment, and that is, what if you put up a wall or a fence blocking the easement that you used to use? Isn't that a physical action of your intent not to use the easement any longer? Absolutely, right? So, that's one of the examples that we often see as an easement or as an abandonment termination, or termination by abandonment. Now comes my favorite. Merger doctrine. So an easement is extinguished when the title to the easement and the title to the servient land become vested in the same person. What does that mean? That means property holder A, oh, I was really gonna do that right in the middle of it. Okay, that means property holder A purchased property B or vice versa. Now they own both properties and it's effectively become one property, but you can hold title to two separate pieces of property even if they are one within the other. But they own, because it could stay two parcels, but they own both of them. Why do you think it is that that then extinguishes the easement?
Because why would you need an easement to your own property?
Why would I need to ask myself permission of myself, right? AJ, would you allow me to go across? Sure, you seem like a nice person. Just be careful with it. You don't do that, right? So there is no more request for use or grant of easement. That terminates. This again creates our zombie versus reincarnation circumstance. Now, if this gets sold to somebody else, because you decide, I just don't need all this land, do the easements automatically reappear again? Do they?
If the grantor sells to the purchaser,
If this now is not vested in the same person. So I own parcels A and B and then I decide, I don't really need both, so I sell parcel B again to somebody else.
You need access again.
Well, but you have to create a new easement by necessity, right? If it's not an easement by necessity, is it automatically revived? Nope. Nope. You have to start fresh, okay? So that's why it's really important, because what do you see on the exam? You're gonna see the termination of the easement because I purchased, and then you're gonna see what? Some creation, because if it's not an easement by necessity, what are you gonna have? Right? So you have to start at creation again and do your next easement. If not, then your position would be no new easement was created. Let me show it to you differently. Do it this way. Oops. Ooh, that didn't work. Parcel A, parcel B. Here's the road down here. Do I need to cross their property? Because what if they changed the way the property was drawn out, right? What if they cleared all that land, made it part of part A, and then made B this whole piece? Don't have an easement by necessity, right? So, under those circumstances, you may not have a new easement. It may just terminate. And now you have two pieces of property. If they wanted to then cross, let's say here, or maybe this is where the road ended, and they had to go in here and get onto the or onto a new road, then you'd have to have some other way of doing that. You couldn't have an easement by necessity here necessarily because they have another way off, right? They're not landlocked, but maybe they give them an express easement or easement by grant, and they say, yeah, you can go this way as well. So it's about 15 minutes longer if you go the other way, which isn't unreasonable, but we're gonna do you a solid. Okay, you'd have to create a new easement, maybe an express easement, and then you have to give the scope of that. Okay. All right. Then we've got the last, which is an easement by prescription. The servient owner may extinguish the easement by interfering with it in accordance with the elements of adverse possession. So those are rather all the ways, the 8 ways that you can terminate an easement. So now, let me be very clear when I say this to you guys. That is the approach for easements. The next thing I'm going to tell you about is not part of the easements approach, but it is a related issue that should always be discussed as another issue if you're discussing easements. Does that make sense to everybody? This should not be an element of an easement. It is a related issue. Like fixtures and waste aren't of the same issue, they are of relation, okay? This is the issue of license. This is a mere privilege to enter another's land for some delineated purpose. License are not subject to the statute of frauds. You do not need to have a writing to create a license as a result. Licenses are freely revocable at the will of the licensor, unless estoppel applies to bar the revocation. So let's talk about a little bit of that. Bless you.
Thank you.
A ticket to a Broadway show is a license. Tickets create freely revocable licenses. Let me give you an example. You go to a Broadway show opening night and you somehow score front row tickets because you paid just an exorbitant amount of money, right? But last minute they say, hey, I'm gonna change my person this year. They're saying Prince Harry and his new wife are gonna be in the country and they would love to go and view this, and they bump you from your seats. Can they do that? Yeah, pretty much, unless estoppel applies, which I don't see how you would create that. I used Oprah before, but I just feel like I guess she's still Oprah, but okay. So Prince Harry shows up with his wife Meghan, and she Duchess? I don't know, whatever. Okay, so they show up and they basically bump Mr. and Mrs. Smith out of their seats, right? The proprietor can absolutely do that. Ticket is a license, it's freely revocable.
Also answers a great question that a lot of times you get asked about such things. Why is it that airports and airplanes can bump you even though you have a ticket? Now you know.
So, if they can revoke your entry, they will, right? Now, here's another example of a license. If you have a neighbor friend, right? And you say, hey, come on over on my property whenever you like, or your kids can walk across my property if it's easier to get to where you need to go. This is probably aging myself a little bit. Little House on the Prairie, anybody? Okay.
Just something.
Right? Laura Ingalls Wilder, no? Whatever, watch it. So they lived in like a rural area, right? And so the kids walking to school sometimes would cross the properties of the neighbors because it would get them to school faster. At one point, there was a little issue with Laura crossing over a particular gentleman's property, and he said, not happening anymore, don't cross my property. Can he do that? Yeah. He allowed it before, they knocked down some stuff and beat up some stuff, and so he said, not anymore, right? The little nasty kid is walking through my flower bed now instead of walking across the sidewalk that I let him walk across. So, no more on my property. Or, you've got, people getting into it across the lawn because somebody's upset about the dog pooping on my lawn or whatever the circumstance is, right? So, neighbors talking across the fence, this is an oral easement and is unenforceable because it violates the statute of frauds. An oral easement instead creates a freely revocable license. Okay? Now, we talked about the issue of estoppel. What do we say? It's freely revocable unless estoppel applies, right? So estoppel in this case will apply to bar revocation only when the licensee has invested substantial money or labor or both in reasonable reliance on the license's continuation. So everybody read for tonight, right? What if you have invested lots of money and labor and materials to build a channel or a well? Do you think now you could say, thanks for building the well, get off? Probably not. Why? Because licenses are freely revocable unless estoppel applies. And in this case, Estoppel will apply to bar revocation only when the licensee has invested substantial money, yep, labor, yep, or both, in reasonable reliance of the licensee's continuation, or license's continuation.
So it's really a contract question.
Mm-hmm.
It's just reasonable reliance, right? You change your position substantially on the promise of someone else, right? That's estoppel, that's reasonable reliance, right? Or detrimental reliance.
So let me say this. License, again, is a related issue that should always follow an easement discussion. It is not an element of easement. It is not part of the story. It is a related story. It is not a chapter in the story. It is a related book, okay? Now, the issue of profits. And I'm not talking profits like money, okay? The issue of profits is neither, well, it's not part of the same set, but it is its own book, okay? So, the profit entitles its holder to enter the servient land and take something from it, usually, and it's going to be some type of natural resource, okay? Or some resource that has been planted. So it's going to be some type of crop, but generally speaking, it's going to be soil or some substance of the soil like minerals, timber, oil, and it shares all the risks of an easement. So it looks very much like an easement, but it's called a profit because you are actually deriving some resource or some substance from the land. Okay? I do also want to mention, and I'm going to go back to this for a moment, an easement in gross. Is that transferable? No. Always? It is transferable in one circumstance, and that is where it's for a commercial purpose. Okay? So if it's for a commercial purpose, it can be transferable. So that is easements, licenses, and profits. That's all of it. All you have to do now is apply your facts. Your approach will always look the same. It will always have identification of the easement, the creation of the easement. You will need to identify whether it's affirmative or negative. You will need to identify whether or not it is appurtenant or engross. You're then going to identify if it is appurtenant, the servient and the dominant tenement, and then you're going to identify the second step, right? The scope. Should there not be any issue of excessive use, then scope is going to be a pretty straightforward discussion, and then you move into termination. Again, as I mentioned, most of these things do not get revived. You would have to go back and start a new easement. So you have to start again, creation, scope, and termination. You understand why this would make a very easy exam for us to write, correct? Because we can get out a couple, 3 easements quickly, okay? Now, for you, I know that seems a little daunting, but understand the approach is the same, which means you would have a creation, a scope, and a termination, at least in your headers. Maybe the last easement still exists, right? So that would be a very lovely exam to have if I was a student.
And you just gave me a great idea.
I know.
Actually.
So that being said, even after you talk about all your different easements, what are you going to talk about?
License.
License, always, right? Are you going to talk about profits always? Only if it's present, okay? All right, one more time. Easement, right? Non-possessory interest that entitles its holder to some form of use or enjoyment of another's land called the servient tenement. Go through creation. 2 factors you need to consider are affirmative or negative, 4 ways to create an affirmative easement, prescriptive, implied, necessity, or grant, or express if you want to use Pine. Then we talk about whether it's appurtenant or engross. If it's appurtenant, you need to identify the dominant and the servient tenement. Then you go into scope. Again, should there not be any issues of excessive use, then scope is going to be a very straightforward discussion. Then you go into termination. We've got 8 ways it can terminate. Estoppel, necessity, destruction of the servient tenement, condemnation of the servient tenement, release, abandonment, merger, and prescription. Okay? Then we get into bump out. We're out of easements. Now we're going to the license issue. Licenses are going to be always discussed in relation to an easement. It's a mere privilege to enter another's land for some delineated purpose. Licenses are not subject to the statute of frauds, and they are freely revocable unless estoppel applies. Okay? Estoppel will apply if there has been a significant investment of labor, funds, or both. Then we have the related issue, but not always present issue of profits. Profits entitle its holder to enter the servient land and take from it. Generally speaking, you're going to see issues of timber, soil, minerals, oil, some resource of the property. I would arguably say you could do, if you had an apple orchard or crops, things like that. Okay? So that's it.
Can you repeat just the occasion where you would be talking about several easements, like what happens, so the easement? So can you go into that again, about why we would be talking about a couple easements in an exam?
If you would be talking about a couple of easements, okay. I suppose if you had an easement by necessity and implied easement, you could have both of those. Because what's the rule for an implied easement? And I realized when I did that, I forgot to talk about negative easements. So light, air, support, stream water from an artificial flow, and a minority of jurisdictions, there's a 5th of scenic view. So you could have an implied easement and a necessity easement, right? So if you have a landlocked situation, but you also want to like talk another easement, which I don't know that you would need to, but you could say the previous use was apparent, it's landlocked, right? There's no other way. And 2, the parties expected the use would survive division because it's reasonably necessary to the dominant land's use and enjoyment. Well, of course, otherwise I can't get on and off my property. So I suppose that could fall into 2 different categories. And what if they wrote it up? What else would it fall under? Grant, right. Now, I don't think that you could have a prescriptive easement along with those because of the fact that it was expressly written. It can't be hostile. Who wants an easement, right?
What do you think, by the way, when it comes to negative easements, what do you think the hot law is right now? Anyone know? A lot of new law on this. Very interesting too. If you're thinking about real property, you might actually, especially out here too, it's really interesting. What do you think hot law right now of these negative easements? That's an interesting one, but no, not yet. Maybe that might be next though. That's an interesting one. So why don't you just get it right instead of being right next to it? You've like done that 3 times. What's going on right now that all of a sudden landowners or homeowners even in particular are going like, hey, wait a minute. that we really didn't have for, oh, I don't know, until very, very recently. If you think about it, nobody really thought much about it. Negative rights to solar. People want to have solar panels now, and then someone wants to block the sun. What do you think? Generally speaking, in California, you can't. There's a sort of an implied easement that if you want to put in solar, because we want you to use solar. Very interesting law, worth looking up. Very curious. Not the same in every state, but in California, again, we're very much at the forefront of this. We want people to put in solar. There's a new law in California, I don't know how many of you know this, by the way, but in gated communities, they can no longer outlaw solar panels. Can't do it because they want you to use solar power. So even if your CCR say no solar panels, too bad, it's against public policy now.
It's just like if your CCNR said you had to keep your lawn in certain order during the drought.
Yeah.
HOAs were prohibited from requiring you to keep your grass, green, but you could have somebody at least keep their garden maintained. So there's a difference between having your grass die and having a bunch of stuff in disarray and look really nasty, right? Now, chances are if your grass is dying, it's not going to be overgrowing, right? But maybe they have trees dying, in which case then you'd say, well, you need to remove the tree. You can't just have the tree there dead. See the distinction?
Yeah, and also they can, they don't, I mean, usually your CCNRs won't do this, but another interesting byproduct of that, can they force you to like water between 5 and 7 in the morning? The answer is yes. They could put reasonable restrictions on when you can water so that you maximize the use. Interesting. And also, they can't quite do it yet, but they're getting kind of close. Are they actually going to be able to, if you want to have sprinklers, that you have to actually put in ones that are water, water economically? Because there's different types of sprinklers.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is not yet. They're real close though. I think that one's coming. Right
Well,
now you can
you're getting pretty
pretty much
close,
do
but they're
what you
basically
want.
marketing like bubblers and
Yeah.
different things that use less water. So there's water conservation in that versus the old sprinklers that just like excessively use water. You can actually, though, they do get very specific about if you have a damaged sprinkler that you must repair that immediately, because then there's like an massive overuse of water. You've seen those sprinklers where it's like spraying for like the 3 minutes that it's on, but it's like spraying up to the sky and like a ton of water is pouring out of it instead of like a little right? Everybody's done the sprinkler, right? So you know how it sounds, you know what it looks like. You know what I'm referring to, right? The dance? Okay. I'm not gonna do that. I will say, however, there's only one dance that I cannot do. And it pains me every time I try. My body will not physically do the proper movements at the same time for the Running Man. Can't do it. Can't do it. It's the only one. Can't do it.
What is that?
Well, I can't show you. Sorry. We literally just had this conversation on Thanksgiving, and I proceeded to stand in my parents' living room for several minutes attempting to do it again. Can't. Can't. Nope. Mm-mm. All through chair and dance, could not do the Running Man. Breaks my heart. Okay.
Getting kind of interesting law out here.
It is.
It is very, very interesting.
It also transitioned because when we get into negative reciprocal
Oh, yeah.
covenants, or yes,
Yeah.
then sorry, I was like trying to think. There's like 9 different ways to describe that. So in a common scheme, effectively a gated community, we used to be able to tell people you must have at least 2 trees in the front, so much lawn, whatever that is. Then we went through a drought in California, right? And then what do you think a lot of people were transitioning to, especially out here? Desert landscaping. Could you tell people desert landscaping even though it's going to look completely different than the rest of the community? Nope. You effectively had to grant that. You had to also grant the use of turf instead of real grass, and which actually the initial investment can be significantly expensive, more expensive than actual sod, but you effectively had to agree to let them do that. And then as time went on through the drought, you started seeing more of a transition. So it wasn't just mere pockets of the property or of the development. It was pretty prominent.
And again, well, we'll get to that soon, actually, that's next week, yeah. It's interesting though, because let's just say, for instance, again, there's lots of weird stuff out there. It's like, come out here and it's like, wow, what a cool place to do real property. It's lots of stuff you don't get in other districts at all. Certainly not in LA. But anyways, the other one that I always find really interesting, and you see it from time to time too, it's like, what happens if when you buy a place, right, particularly with a common scheme, and we all know what common schemes are, not paper, all the houses look the same, right, on the plat, that's what that means. What happens when all of a sudden conditions change? When you bought the place, you were allowed to have grass, now you're one of 5 people of 50 that still has grass. Can they force you to change? It's an interesting issue. The answer is actually, what do you think, yes or no?
No.
The answer is yes.
Huh.
Because changed circumstances may require you to again buy into the new common scheme but here's a big if, if it is economically beneficial to do so. So in other words, by having now a more desert terrain, it's economically, more pushes particularly the value of the real property, you're definitely gonna have to do it. Because the other homeowners around you, if you're dragging down house prices, forget it, you have to do it. Even if you don't want to.
Wow.
Interesting, a real interesting law.
Or if it's not more economically beneficial, but you just wanna,
Then it's, I don't know,
you just wanna be an outlier just because.
Yeah, no, and the answer is really, for gated communities, the answer is what does the CCNR say?
Right.
Because they can force you to do things like that, they can override all sorts of things. There's some things they can't, there's some public policy in California that can't override, but things like that, generally they leave economic value to the CCM, to the individual communities. So it's a real interesting law, and you see it, I see it, all the time when I'm going through these. I go to different, my wife's a realtor, and we'll go to all these different places. And, you'd be surprised, especially when you go places like DHS, it's like half the place looks great, the other half, it's got cars in the front. And you're like, okay, that's a pit bull over there, Tato. Can they force you to change that? And the answer is probably, even though when you bought it, right?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
I remember back in like 2004 or 5, they made residents of the Cathedral City Code, I think it was, they all had to purchase a sewer system.
Oh,
They
yeah.
had to buy, they didn't have it initially, but then everyone had to buy it, then it was a big news story.
Yeah,
Remember?
that's
Was
a
it
little bit different, but it's the same theory. But that's a little different law because there's certain areas that you buy in that should the city then require you to put in things like sewer systems. In other words, can they force you off of septic tanks? And the answer is yes. It's things like that. We know that they can do that. When you buy the home, you're buying it with the expectation you might run into that someday. It can happen, yeah, things like that. The other one too is out here you see it a lot. You never see it anywhere else. It's these things called Melrose tax. Does anyone ever, does they know what that is? Yeah, it's interesting law. It's you can agree to pay a tax when you buy land to fund utilities for an area of land, and there's a whole bunch of places out there that have Melrose taxes, and it's ROOS, by the way, Melrose. And what happens is you buy land, particularly right now in North India, a bunch of places that they don't have any infrastructure, so you can actually agree to voluntarily pay, like, I think it's capped at like 4% tax on the property, with the understanding that it will go toward building infrastructure like streets, lights, plumbing, the whole thing. Real interesting. It becomes very problematic, of course, when the builders go belly up and you're paying this tax and all of a sudden you're not getting any of those, because guess what? Tax doesn't end. You can be sitting on this land that you were promised would, be the next frontier, so to speak, and would be a modern community, and then all of a sudden you're sitting there 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, you've been paying an additional 3% tax on your property, and they haven't made a single upgrade. And we have a couple of properties out there right now that, you know, if you go look in the Desert Sun, go look up their, you know, backlog of stuff. Just look up Melrose tax, and you see all these great stories about how people are ready to, you know, kill the Indios Council because they have to approve it. So, anyway.
That was one of the selling points of the community that I moved into, was they had a big thing when they were selling it was no Melrose.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the communities surrounding us do. So it was a huge selling point for them.
And you know, whenever they, you know, it's actually the city council has to sign off on it, and they actually have to do a couple of things. And so what do you think they always ask for, by the way? The maximum, the minimum, or do they even guess? Well, what do you think? You know, they're supposed to make a reasonable guess as to how much this is gonna cost. Do you think that ever happens? Of course not, they just click the box for the maximum because it's money coming into them. So that's been under review too lately. It's like, are you guys really figuring this out, or are you just always checking the 3.5 box or whatever it is? I think it's up to like 3.5. I think it's not quite 4 right now. They can charge you. But I've never seen a Melrose tax that's not for the maximum. Never. So you do kind of think at a certain point, you're like, hey, wait a minute here. What's going on here? They're bringing in the maximum amount taxpayers are paying, and they're not doing the upgrades on the land that it was promised to be put on. And it keeps going on and on and on.
That's like, I think the same in Palm Springs that happened too.
Yeah, it happens in Palm Springs all the time too. I mean, out here in the East Valley, it's the big ticket items are up in North India right now. There's a bunch up there that didn't get their value. Although that's the up and coming area. I was just reading that the other day. You want to buy property now?
I see that they're replacing the Babies R Us with a Burlington coat factory and a Marshalls,
Here you go.
or they're just putting the sign up for 2 years.
Where I'm at, San Manuel is expanding, even though we're not association, but city code enforcement is going through because they're expecting more people to come in, so they want the community to look, so they are telling people now that they can't. They're trying to make it into like association, you can't park here, they don't want oil on the, you know, they don't want you on the grass, but they wanted to.
They're municipal code violations.
And there's
So they're really
and there's a huge, I can't remember what it is, if you email me or remind me, but some developer just bought this massive piece of land out here. And it's like in one of those areas where, like, if you look at there now, it's right off the freeway, and there's nothing there.
It's coming.
That's oh yeah, and it's up out here. So I was looking at that going, and it's a huge piece of land. It's huge piece of land.
When you say huge, like how huge, how many acres?
A lot of acres. This is going to be a big community. Yeah, this is big for when you're going to build housing, and they're a housing company, so we know they're going to do it. It's funny. I just read that. I was in the DS the other day, and I was like, follow that guy. They know where the growth is going to be, so it's going to be high.
More clients, is it like out by like Fantasy Springs, like, you know, as you.
Yeah, it's out there where there's nothing right now,
Huh.
but that's where they're going into. It's out here now. They're going east. They're filling in. They're starting to fill in the blanks.
You know what that means? It means Uber Eats and DoorDash are going to deliver to the people in North India.
That's for sure.
Everything like east of Jackson, they're basically like, too far. Not so much. Sorry, we'll let you know if we get service to your area. But they'll deliver here. I did find that interesting, and I found the trick. If you work in an area where they deliver, but you don't live in an area where they deliver, order at the end of your workday, and then you can take it home with you. Right? I know.
Work smarter, not harder.
The tale of a working mother. I don't feel like cooking again. Okay.
Well, you know my theory on all that. You know, hon, what are we having for dinner? It's not as far as I go. I have no idea. You know, that comes from where? What?
You know how many marriages ended over, I don't know, whatever you want. And then there's like 9 offers made. No, none of those sound good.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever you want though, but not one of those 9 things. We don't have video stores anymore, so you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just true, actually.
All right, well, I would say why don't we maybe get one case out of the way before the break, and then the balance we can do after the break.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about easements is you literally learn everything you need to know tonight. Okay, that's really easements. So when we're doing the cases, if the facts are good and we understand how these principles attach to the facts, right? This case tonight's a breeze. So I'm sort of counting on the fact that you still have your ability to write really good briefs with really good facts. Because if that is so, we will be quite quick tonight. If it is not, I will be banging my head.
There's 10 cases.
Because they are a
It
little
should not take very
tricky
long.
sometimes, yeah. But if you have trouble, don't feel too bad, because the facts are a little tricky. But the law, you just got everything you need to know.
I'm not a hide in the ball person. I don't like to do that
That's right.
after you give me 10 case briefs. It doesn't make any sense. Let's apply these as examples. We do this by a casebook method because we want to learn by example, right? But if we know what the roadmap is, then we can apply the example to what we've just learned, okay?
And that is the roadmap. That's what you need. Okay? You can't say you can't find something that's obscure somewhere, but you can have to try.
All right, so who'd like to take Mitchell versus Castello?
And again, please rely on the headings, the book headings. This is about, let me see, express creation. Well, what do you suppose this one is about? Express creation. So but that's the nature of easements.
Oh yeah, there's literally a header that says termination. Okay,
Yeah, I mean, there's literally, one says scope. So if you don't tell me about the scope, I mean, what would you know what I'm saying? When in doubt, use the table of contents. You know what I'm saying?
that's how I started doing outlines.
Yeah, that's how I started doing my outlines too. I started with tables of content.
All right, Mitchell versus Castello? Yes.
Oh,
Oh, I thought you raised your hand.
no, I'll do it. I was fixing.
You were just yawning.
No, I was fixing.
You didn't.
I was fixing my answer.
Oh my god, this just never gets old. I'm sorry.
Okay. So.
I'm not sorry. Okay.
Where's Castle? So Mrs. Sally Stock owned 3 lots of land. The easements derived from 2 conveyances made by Mrs. Stock. In 1938, Mrs. Stock conveyed to Malcolm Smith and wife parcel 2, which had the driveway strip. It reserved a driveway for the filling station lot upon an adjoining parcel. There was express language in this conveyance which read, "It is expressly agreed and understood that grantors, their heirs, or assigns shall not build or permit anyone else to construct any type of building or anything else on the portion of lot described as follows, and that the grantor shall have the right to use the part of said lot as a driveway." Second conveyance to their daughter, Mrs. Isabel Anderson, took another lot, which is 1 with the wash rack strip, which also adjoined the filling station and which had a wash shed. Mrs. Costello, which was the plaintiff in the original case, she was another daughter of Mrs. Scott. She succeeded to ownership of the filling station and renewed the lease until 1953. Smith and wife later conveyed the lot to Mitchell and Powers, the defendants, in 1947, and the language regarding the reservation of the driveway was unchanged. The only change was that the original one said grantors, they changed it from grantors to grantees. The defendants argue that the provision in question was nothing more than a so-called easement in gross, meaning that it was a personal right of stock and did not pass on to the plaintiff.
Excellent.
They also argue that the provision is repugnant to the grant of the entire lot and should be treated as if it was never written. Both the lower courts ruled in favor of Costello. The lower courts decreed that the reservation of the driveway was without limit and point of time, but the other is to expire on removal of the projecting part of the wash shed for any cause. What I have as my issue is, must there be express language stating the driveway reserved by stock will pass to her devisee in order for the easement to be recognized. So the defendant in this case argues that the absence of the express language that allows for the easement to be inheritable should establish an easement in gross and thus only intended to benefit stock, not transferred by inheritance. The court considered the grantor's intent to create an easement that runs with the land and the absence of language that demonstrates the inheritance of the easement would not defeat the creation of an appurtenant easement. They also considered not only the terms of the grant itself, but the nature of the right and surrounding circumstances. So they rejected the argument. What I have as a rule is neither words of inheritance nor other words of art are essential to the valid reservation of an appurtenant easement of uneven or limited duration. So they affirmed the lower court's decision.
Pretty good, yeah. Okay, so let me just you can sit down, please, that's fine. So would it be fair to say about this case, notice first of all that it's in 1950s, right? So here we are again on this line. Going forward, we're going to be talking more about intent, right? Going backwards, common law, they look more at the words, right? And so what they're trying to look at in this case is you have a situation where one relative is trying to pass land to another, and they're trying to figure out whether it's passing, if it's an easement in gross, then it's particular to one person, and so it dies when they die, disappears when they go. If it's a pertinent easement, right, then the bottom line is it passes with the land. Notice how we're going to use that statement now. So it's actually an important designation to make. But the thing is we don't really have intent, right? I mean, we don't know what the testator really intended in this one. It's kind of weird because they use heirs and assigns and all these words. So what do they default to when you have something like an easement? Well, what they do is they default to the totality of the situation. So what you do is you look at the land and you say, I'm looking at this land. I can't imagine that that person would have passed the land without passing the easement, or it could have said, well, I'm looking at the land, just the very totality of all the circumstances. I can't believe that this person only meant this person, or I can believe this person only meant this person. Look at the totality, because again, we don't really have intent, but we can infer it from the situation, particularly with easements. And so this court in this case said, well, okay, the words are bad. Was this 100 years ago, we'd have a lot of trouble because words were strictly construed. And so this would be a very poorly written grant at best, and probably would have failed because they would have said, don't know. Modernly, again, right on that cusp where they're going forward, where intent is more important. Well, if you remember criminal law, what's the best way to get someone's intent when you're not sure what it is? Look at the totality of the situation, same theory, works for them, works for us. Are we good? We're good. Excellent. Good
Take
job.
a break until 10 to 8, please. But we gotta get started right then.
Yeah, I want to be gross.
There we go.
Yes. So this would be, you need to do, you get that. Point back. Get out of the way. If I can do it, if we have, but don't go out, just don't go out.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah. That's what I think. Oh, this looking so good. I can't eat anything.
Wow.
I started wearing these Invisalign things.
Oh,
So I'm like usually like I'm just snacking on everything. I'm like, can I have anything but water?
cool. Okay, you got them out?
Again, I just didn't bring anything. Like, it's in the car. I'm gonna have to brush my teeth again and put it back on.
I like those are so great. All right,
It
no.
was really annoying. Like it feels like I have like, you know when you have something that's stuck in your teeth
Yeah.
and you want to get it out, you can't. But you're so close. You know that's the feeling of having these on.
This is so great, you can't tell you.
It-
Does it hurt? Is it like, or
No.
did you do it for like retaining what you had before?
It's to close up the gaps and just straighten it.
Okay.
So it's just closing it. Like it's just like just hitting it.
Yeah.
Basically. And then the bottom teeth are starting to like get out of place. But I don't have much, maybe 6 months on. But
It's like,
it's
it's really straight.
no every time I tell people I want to close up the gaps,
No,
like, no one says no one sees it.
I don't see. You know what happened to me? So I had braces when I was young.
Yeah.
I had really buck teeth. But anyway, so I had braces successfully.
Yeah.
But about a year and a half ago, I had implant. I mean, yeah, they took tooth out.
Oh yeah.
Put an implant in. But I had to wait 6 months because they had to do grafting of it.
Oh wow.
So I did. But what happened was, and then I ran out of money. 6 months passed. And what happens is if you don't do it right away, so your teeth start moving.
Yep. Yep.
So now you have this space now. I'm going, the implant came out. I have it. I was clearly looking like too. I was able to save it. But my teeth are moving, and I'm like, no. So you know what I thought? Something like that?
What?
Like the poor man's, you know. Because like I lost my retainer years ago, but I didn't need it. I was, you know, my teeth are fine.
Yeah.
So I don't have a retainer, and I went to go to a dentist to get a retainer. They will only do from this point on. They won't go back to, you know, they won't say, I want them to go back.
Oh, because it moved, so you want
They
to
moved, I want them to go back to what it used to
Yeah.
be. And talking about teeth and teeth.
We're talking about teeth and braces and stuff.
Oh,
But I just
teeth
got
and
the
braces.
Yeah.
Lions and tigers.
So like I said,
Braces, lions, come on. Huh? Yeah.
I was gonna say, for that stuff, they're like root
Yeah, root canals.
canals.
Okay.
Although I will say that I have been watching, I'm now just completely like absorbed in commercials for toothpaste.
Yeah,
What happens to that class? Nobody's there? Don't they usually
Oh, I
have
don't know.
I think you're wrong.
the guys that I had last year? They're
Yeah, yeah,
usually
Yeah,
here.
they do.
Yeah, they're all, yeah.
Really?
Because I thought, I don't know what they're doing.
Oh, well.
Maybe they're doing something like
Something important.
Yeah, like something on site or something.
What's the date tonight? Well, the end of the court is not tonight. Well, John's here, so it's not tonight because he goes to that with them. I don't know, what, maybe they went on a field trip or something. That must be it. So, or maybe,
What's their
Rose's
costume?
dress. That's what.
I thought he went to cemetery. I thought he went to cemetery.
We'll do a cemetery.
I wouldn't doubt it.
I mean,
You know, that wouldn't shock you, so. But, yeah, but they sometimes they have trouble making, Julie's really busy.
Oh.
Really busy, and so I don't know, but sometimes they have.
What other classes, they will make them up on Saturday, so something.
Yeah.
Third year was making up, right?
Yeah, so I gotta move my last law class, because that's the night they go to in support, so I gotta move it to that Monday, I gotta tell them.
Oh.
But I'll be on Monday, and then I'll be.
oops.
So, there you go. Anyways, please do not let me interrupt you talking about.
No, thank you.
So, but I do want to say very quick, I've just become absolutely fascinated by toothpaste commercials.
Yeah, why?
Because they keep adding stuff to it. And I keep saying, well, why do people even go to the dentist? Why don't you just, they make it sound like you should brush your teeth once a day and never have any trouble.
Right.
They stress nutrition as like the main thing that really determines your teeth. Because they're talking about the whole, look at like their Cro-Magnons and everything, look at their teeth structures, they had less like, they have less cavities and all this stuff.
Oh, they had no
Like,
sugar.
Well, they, yeah.
Yeah, exactly,
They
yeah.
had zero sugar,
Right.
they had zero, there's something else that works like that, grinds your teeth. It's sugar,
Vinegar.
it's, well, there's just.
Oh, candy.
Acid.
Yeah, candy.
Oh, and salt.
Oh,
Salt.
salt,
Yes,
okay.
salt actually will also, well, because think about
Yeah, it's an abrasive.
it, it actually is abrasive.
Huh.
And so these were, up and until I think, I was reading something about that's interesting.
Yeah.
Up and until the time of Romans, decay of teeth as we know it today virtually didn't exist.
Huh.
And then they always find when they, well, if you notice too, notice when they unearth all those old skulls, so they always have everything.
Yes.
They always have their teeth.
It's true, and there are no fillings in there, well, there are no fillings or
And
anything.
then all of a sudden, the world started to crisscross because of spices and stuff like that, Constantinople. I mean, it is odd, but one of the things that you can actually attribute to the Crusades is to the day in question. Because now we're putting stuff in our mouth that we never did before.
Yeah, they share
People
them.
like spices, people like salt, people like, at one time, I can't remember what year it was, but the most valuable commodity in the world was not gold, salt.
Yeah.
They would pay more for salt, they would pay more for an ounce of salt than they would for an ounce of gold at one time.
For taste, not like salt and roadways or anything.
No, and it was, yeah, because people got used to eating food with salt.
Wow.
This is true.
Preserve your food.
That's why, and again, it's arguable, I'm not super sure, but don't you find it curious that somehow Constantinople survived so much longer than anything else? And everything else disappeared, right? Everything was taken over by the Muslim world. Here's Constantinople. One theory is because, well, it's a dual theory. But one theory is just that Constantinople was where we got all the spices for the West.
Really?
So if you cut off Constantinople, you cut off the trade. But at the same time, that's why we allowed the famous Silk Road caravans and things. That they, it was so profitable for the Muslim world to keep Constantinople open that they just did it.
Huh.
Yeah.
And then, but finally, what happened was some king came in and said, "Oh, that away we go." And that's when they got rid of Constantinople and changed it to Istanbul. But I mean, everything I told you is true. Whether that was the major reason, nobody's quite sure.
Wow.
But that is true, and we do know it at least played into some of the politics.
Yeah.
And that's also, if you ever wondered, this is one other little fact, and then also, but anyways, I never will, but anyways. Lots of other bathrooms I will. Anyways, but if you ever wonder why it is then that in England in particular they have such It's because they rejected all of that. They said, hell with you.
And bad teeth, do you know England has bad
That's
teeth?
great.
Yeah,
They have terrible teeth, what, are they're bad dentists, and why are they all bad teeth? It's a joke, the whole thing.
They said that the culture, they accept the fact that, you know, the teeth.
yeah, they don't, you don't go to the, none of my friends who virtually to a one have ever gone to a dentist.
Ever?
Pretty much ever.
Ah, so it's part of the
Never
culture.
Yeah, so
They
most
look
companies
at
are like not
profit.
keeping straight teeth.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
They just don't go.
And like the gaps and.
Well, you know, I mean, it's a different aesthetic too. I mean, they actually take that aesthetic and look at it. You know, it's like you say, oh, everyone in England has bad teeth. They're like, yeah. I mean, it's funny because you're talking about braces. Have you ever seen an English person with braces?
No,
Probably not.
never.
Maybe in the royal family, well, I don't know. But, you know, it's not considered a sign of, it was,
It's not.
to my knowledge, it's never really been considered a sign of high society.
Yeah.
They just accept it as it is. I mean, gaps in teeth are very cool there, especially if it's look.
Yeah.
That's considered very attractive,
Yeah.
very attractive.
Really?
Yeah, whereas here it's like you're running the dentist, right? Blah, blah, blah. And they're like over there saying, that's a lovely gap, my dear. Want me a beer, mate? You betcha.
Oh my God.
Are you wearing yours?
Yeah, it started when we talked about me not being able to eat snacks. And then you and I got into it, and then Professor.
Went down rabbit hole.
This,
But it's cool.
to me, it's like equivalent of like having, I didn't tell you, it's like the having food stuck in your mouth, you're trying to get it out, but you're so close to getting it out. This is like all day, like feeling, like,
How long do you have to wear it for?
well, the box is like 6 months, and then they evaluate from there. But it's 24 hours.
Oh, this one.
And do you replace it every day?
No, I change every 2 weeks.
Every
So I
2
have a
weeks.
full box of all the things. So if I were to look at the last like little like packet, it would have like it to where it's like already like the things already the teeth are all put together. Imagine I put that on, it said like day one, I put the last day. It would hurt so much.
Sore.
I put it in.
Have you tried it?
No, I don't.
Is it
I
hard?
spent too much
Is it
money.
hard plastic? Really hard? Is it, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's
Take it out and think.
No. It's gross.
Oh, God. It's
They
teeth.
build water.
It's like yeah. Like
So
slobber. It's, you know.
Did you go to a dentist to get this? Or
I
they send
went-
you like a?
I went
whole
there and then they
kit?
did a whole scan
Okay.
and like it came out to like a 3D model of my whole mouth. It was cool. And then after a while they did like this thing where it's like this video of what it looks like over time. They did like a front frame and then it just shifted. I was like, oh my God, it's what my mouth looks like.
But it's so cool they can do that nowadays, you know?
This company came out like a couple of years ago, and all you used to, the store wasn't there yet, because in Palm Desert, I only went because I knew it was there. I would have to like order a kit, buy it,
Yeah,
like
that's
a
what I've
mold,
seen on
and then send
TV.
it out and then come back. This was my 30-minute appointment, that's it.
Can I ask you about how much it costs for the whole shebang?
I was like $2,000.
That?
Yeah. I used to want it, I
mean-
wanted to do it before, then just was like, it's $1,000 a month. I was like, no, thank you.
Dang.
What's $1,000 a month?
Well, I went through that just like years and years ago. They said for this Invisalign, you're paying like $1,000 a month. I think it's because of the full visit and everything else. I'm like, I can't afford that. So never mind.
They promote that a lot on TV and
Yeah.
It works good.
But I went to their sister company. Apparently, it's their sister company. I'm like, oh, duh. Except it's cheaper.
You know, so I have my original mold of my teeth. But I bought this stuff on Amazon. It's a mold that you put in hot water.
Mhm.
And then, they're these, they're like,
Are they
little
like?
pellets.
Oh, I was saying, it kind of sounds like a mouthpiece, like football one.
Yeah, it's kind of, so what you can do is you can put it, I haven't done it yet, so I'm like, I don't have time to mess with it, yeah. But so I'm gonna put it, I guess it forms into this mold in the hot water, and then you form it around, so I'm gonna form it around my original mold of my teeth.
Oh.
And then it'll get hard, and then I'll put it in my mouth, put my teeth back to where they were. You know, back to the, cause I don't know, it's probably gonna hurt, yeah,
Oh.
you know what But put it back to the, and then I'll go back to the dentist in Mexico to get my implant put back in.
Oh,
Because I don't want the implant now,
right.
because my teeth are out, my teeth have moved.
Yeah.
So I want to go back where they were, and then get the,
You're gonna go to Mexico?
oh my God, the best dentist in Mexico.
You know this?
Yeah, well, it's not my dentist, he's a lot of people's dentist, huh?
Dentists and doctors.
And doctors, yeah, and Yuma, Abedonis. Best, I mean,
I've
you
never
never
gone.
been?
I've never been to Mexico.
I've never, well, I don't know, I won't go. But they always want me to stay. They always think I'm from there. And, you're from here, but you live in the United, no, I don't. But I always have relatives sending medication from.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Strong and.
The strong,
Yeah.
It's the real stuff.
that's the real stuff.
It
The under.
They unapproved.
Yeah, we'll wait 1 more minute past it. And we'll start again, I guess. That's case long time. We can get through that pretty quickly, I think. Maybe. So who's missing?
Daniel.
Yeah.
And Professor Sharp.
That's fine. I don't know about you guys, but I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be.
Me too. I always tell
I'd
people,
rather
I'd rather
be
go,
here.
I love law school so much, it's better than going to the movies for me. It's as fun to me as going to a movie.
Ooh, those were the two that I would always fight about though.
Huh?
Because I liked going to movies so much. That was the one that got me. Although I gave up movies. Well, you have to. You can't. But I used to go to, see you guys, it's an interesting world everyone lives in these days, but I used to go to revival houses. Yeah, does anyone even know what that is? You would have these really little movie theaters that had seen better days. And so what they would do is they would go, and you have to understand it's a different world though. And what they would do is they would go out and they'd get really old movies or they'd get foreign movies. And it was the only place you could see these things. But what you do is it would be like $1. And you'd see like 3, 4, 5 movies in a day
That's amazing.
if you wanted to. You know, it would always be something that was revival
Yeah,
houses.
they still have those in, matter of fact, I think it's like Norco.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally you'll still, there's still a very famous one in Pasadena, they still have. I can't think of the name of it, I think it's called Rialto, but there's one there. And then there's a couple in San Francisco still, but all the ones that are in LA, there's only one left. And it's not really even a revival house anymore, it's more just an independent film movie theater now where they just show, you know, modern, or, you know, things as they come out. It's called a new art. But, you know, we used to have like things like Robert De Niro Fest, and they would literally show for like $1, 24 hours of Robert De Niro Fest. And you took your ticket, you walked in, you walked out. You can see as many
Then
as
you do as I
wanted,
say,
there's
not as
still
I do, right?
that were amazing. So that was tough to give up for me, but what can I do? I had to learn proximate cause.
Oh dear. Okay, 9 more to go.
Really? That's it. All right.
Real property, it's exciting. Some Mignon.
So what about this Willard versus
You
First?
can take this movie title for tonight.
Willard versus First Church of Christ, Supreme Court of California, 1972. Facts are a woman named Genevieve Wiggin. Owned 2 abutting lots in Pacifica known as lots 19 and 20. So lot 19 had a building on it. She sold lot 19 to Mr. Peterson. Lot 20 was used by the church across the street as a parking lot. So Mr. Peterson is interested in selling the lot, and his realtor then becomes interested in buying both of the lots. Peterson approaches the Wigan, and she promises to sell both lots as long as the church is still allowed to use lot 20 for parking lot. So they draw up the agreement, which includes a provision stating that the conveyance was, quote, subject to an easement for the church during church hours, church parking. The easement was set up to run with the land only so long as the property for whose benefit the easement is given is used for church purposes. So the Willards buy the lots and record the deed, which did not mention an easement for parking by the church. A few months later, the Willards find out about the easement and file an action for quiet title against the church. So the issue is whether a grantor may, in deeding real property to one person, effectively reserve an interest in the property to another.
What was the rule we learned earlier? Which one does it automatically go with?
I'm not understanding that.
So we talked about, well, let me ask you this. So is this, let's go through creation. Is this an affirmative or a negative easement?
Affirmative.
And is this, of the affirmative easements, which one is it?
Affirmative.
No? That's a different characteristic.
It is a.
Is it prescriptive?
No.
Is it necessity?
No.
Okay, we got down to 2 now.
Implied.
Is it? Hold on. Didn't they just say they contracted for this and everything? It's all written down? Right. So it's grant.
Right.
Now, let's go to the next characteristic. Is this appurtenant or engross?
Appurtenant because it involves 2 lots.
2 lots that are what?
2 lots that are.
Starts with an A. Ends in a T. We're going Wheel of Fortune rules on this.
Appurtenant
Second letter's a D.
and adverbs?
ADJ.
Oh,
Come on, people! There's only one person playing the game right now.
Yeah, I know. I drew it out.
They are adjacent properties as well, okay?
They're
Right?
adjacent.
Don't they have to be?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So now we've gone through affirmative, it's an easement appurtenant. Which one's the servient tenement?
Servient tenant, the dominant tenant, I have to go this way, because I always get confused with those 2.
Okay.
The dominant is the, boys. I can do this every day. Dominant is the one who's benefiting from this is the
Correct.
church.
Right, so let me ask you again.
Is lot,
Which one automatically does the easement run with?
the dominant.
Correct. When does it run or not run with the servient tenement?
When it is purchased by a bona fide purchaser,
Then what happens?
then
Would it run?
No.
Why? What does it mean to be a bona fide purchaser?
you have to take without notice and for consideration.
Valuable
Valuable
consideration, right? So probably a notice issue, right?
Yeah.
How many types of notice?
Actual,
What are they?
Actual something and record. Actual
Something in record, inquiry.
inquiry and record.
And record notice. So an inquiry and record notice are effectively constructive forms of notice. Okay? So that's how you run through the approach.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
I do that for a reason because then you're gonna be
That's
like,
good.
oh, okay.
Okay.
And Professor Drucker's our resident artist, so
There you go.
he takes that role for sure.
And so the holding was that the reservation does best the interest of the third party. Because it was her intention, I think that the person she sold it to, Peterson, really had, he got it for a cheaper price because she thought he was gonna keep it, let the church continue the easement. So he got it for an even, cheaper price. So he knew, I feel like there was a little bit of, bad faith on Peterson's part.
So are you saying that maybe he can't claim that he didn't have any notice because it was a steal of a deal and there had to be some reason.
Right.
I thought that's what you said.
Thank you.
So, it was her intent all along to have that church continue. I didn't really understand the whole reservation part until a little bit from now.
That's good, very good. All right, let me get that. Okay, real quick, does everyone understand that this is just a drawing? This is what I do, particularly for things like easements. It's very helpful to draw them out, because then it makes a lot more sense. I think anyway.
You don't even have to just be a visual learner for this to be helpful. This is just
It really
helpful because you can
helps.
organize your thoughts.
Yeah,
Especially, let me just say, when we do easements and they start getting into the north portion of the west side of the road and the this and the that, you have to draw it out. Otherwise, you're gonna end up with some kind of weird star shape that intersects, and you're gonna be like, that is literally not a property, so I don't know what to do with that. Okay?
pretty much, yeah. Okay, so, anyway, short version is, everything he said was good, facts were good, is, owner owns 19 and 20, right? Owner is willing to sell lot 20 to a third party as long as he agrees that they can make what was called a common law, a reservation, that the church can continue to use the parking lot. Okay, in other words, she's willing to sell the ownership to him, but he has to let the church use it as a parking lot. That's the common law, what's called a reservation, right? Okay. Problem is at common law, there was no such thing as reserving a third party. That's the problem. You could reserve it in yourself. You couldn't reserve it in the third party. So, Willard, right, guy bought it, or Peterson's the guy bought it, right? All right, so he wants to now pull a fast one and say, whoa, 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 not so quick. You can't make a reservation at common law in a third party. So what did the party say? What year is this case? By the way,
72.
okay, by 72, do we really care what documents say anymore? The answer is probably not. We're much more interested in what?
Intent.
The intent. And they can say from the totality of the circumstances, price, everything else you guys were talking about, it looks to us like you knew damn well that you had to leave that with the church. And oh, that third party stuff at common law, it's 1972, bitches.
Oh, getting saucy.
We did? All right.
Sassy.
Keeping it real.
Mhm.
Yo, LQ for life. I did that the other day to someone in the parking lot. I thought they were gonna. They didn't. They looked at me and said, nah, not you. I tried.
You never know.
That's
You
right.
never know.
You can't judge a book by its cover.
Nope.
Indeed, yeah. That's true. Little they knew that I was a member of a dangerous bike gang.
You and Jesse Ventura.
Yeah, there you go.
Did you read that article today? He went and testified in Orange County as a gang expert about the
Yeah.
Mongols because he was a prior member. Nope, motorcycle club people, not biker gang.
Why not?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not a gang, it's a club.
It's a motorcycle club.
Damn straight.
Um,
One of my best friends is a member of a club. Seriously, he's hilarious. He's 2 years older than me. He's almost bald, but he's got long hair on the side, and he's about 200 pounds. And he's this old Jewish guy that I used to know I grew up with. And now he's a biker.
there you go.
You know?
People go their own route.
Yeah.
Speaking of not judging a book by its cover, I always think of road rage incidents.
Yeah.
I always tell people about this. So any clients that I've had with road rage incidents, I always tell them, be very mindful because you never know. So I know this is like maybe a more contemporary example. There's a girl on an MTV show named, oh my God, I just forgot her name. Janelle. She keeps changing her last name. She keeps getting married. In any event, she was in a road rage incident and the guy like cut her off and then she almost got in an accident. But in the video, they show her taking a gun and putting it next to her because she's carrying a weapon. I don't know what state it's in, so I don't know if it's like an open carry state or whatever the deal may be. But I'm just thinking, here's a mom in her mom car with her kid in the car, and you just never know. It's not like it has to be some person that, looks like a, stereotypical gang member or something like that in a particular kind of car with a gun, or that you would think like, oh, that's the kind of person that might carry a weapon, or, a crowbar or whatever it is that you might have. It can be anybody. Somebody could have a knife on them. Somebody could have whatever. You never know. Somebody could be equipped with a bottle of something that they're going to throw in your car. You can't really ever assume anything about people. So in this case, you can't really ever assume anything.
No. Really can't.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
So.
Or you do so at your own peril.
Yeah.
I can't begin to tell you how many times I've learned that lesson.
All right. So everybody good with that one?
Yeah, pretty straightforward. Huh? Again, we're just leaving the common law behind, but just honoring the intent of the persons making, the transfers. But again, the important thing though to keep in mind is, unless you understand the totality of what's going on, you can't understand the intent. So, today's a great day to really cement that, because easements are all about intent. So we just all. So, and you see that over and over and over in the cases tonight, right? Well, you knew he was using it, right? Easement by implication, easement by use, right? There's no paper, there's no nothing. How did you think they were going to deliver things? Right? Isn't that a case tonight? What did you think they were going to do? That's right. Is that not? If it's not tonight, it's next week. But there's cases that are like, what did you think they were going to do? That's what they break down to. Yeah. Look at the totality of the situation, something like less price or something, or whatever else have you. Pretty much game over. Okay? All right.
Who's got Stoner versus Zucker? Notice this is 1906, by the way.
Kind of interesting, huh?
I'll try this one.
Okay.
It's a California case, a 1906 case. I have that the plaintiff, the plaintiff pleaded that the defendant entered his land in 1899 under a license and constructed a ditch to carry water. The plaintiff never agreed to convey any right of way to the plaintiff, to the easement, or interest in the land with the defendant. So the right to construct and maintain the ditch rests upon the license. So in 1900, plaintiff served notice upon the defendant, that the license to construct and operate the ditch had been revoked. And apparently the defendant had constructed the ditch in order to carry water to their own property and to other people's land. And they spent $7,000 or more on the ditch.
What year was this?
Yeah.
1906. That's a lot.
So how much?
7,000.
Think about what that would be with inflation. A lot more than $7,000.
It's $1 million.
That was a lot of money. Yeah.
So, so when the defendant, or when the plaintiff has served notice on him that he got revoked, that the defendant disregarded the notice and continued entering into the plaintiff's land. He made repairs on the ditch and threatened to continue to trespass on the plaintiff's land. This is what we're talking about when they do all this work on another person's land. So the court found that the defendants are the owners of a right of way for said ditch. And the court also found that consideration for granting of said right of way. So I have as the issue is to the revocability or non-revoke. Is it, can they revoke it or non-revoke of an executed parole license whose execution has involved the expenditure of money, and where from the very nature of the license given, was it a continuous in use?
So let me ask you, what's the rule for a license?
I think we had that, we don't need it in writing.
Well, no, what's the rule of a license? What is a license?
Well, I put down, I found it in this book, under Maxwell versus Bay City Bridge, that the injustice of a revocation.
No. Let's not get there yet.
Okay.
Just tell me what a license is.
What
Before
about-
you get into the exceptions about how to revoke a license, what is a license?
I know we said it.
It's okay.
I put down
It's a mere privilege to enter another's land for some delineated purpose. Right?
Okay.
So let's start there, right?
Mhm.
You're basically inviting somebody upon your land for some delineated purpose. Licenses then are freely revocable unless estoppel applies. That's effectively gonna be your rule. So start with the rule, not the exception. Does that make sense?
Okay.
I always wanna make sure we do this in kind of a chronological fashion, because it's one thing to get to the exception, but if I don't know what it's the exception of, it can cause a little confusion for people understanding the concept. So I'm not making an example of you, I just wanna say, it's really important for us to start there, because I think it makes it easier to understand the exception if we know what the rule is.
Okay.
So,
It's a privilege.
so it's a mere privilege to enter another's land for some delineated purpose. I'm inviting you onto my property for some reason, right? I can revoke that if I don't like the way you're acting on my property, or I decide I no longer want people on my property, right? Unless what? Estoppel applies, right? So here, you basically put together the license. The facts for the license are what? The guy who owns the property where the well was constructed allowed the other folks from the community to come on his property for purposes of constructing a well. Was it the intention of those parties to go on, construct him a well at their expense and then not be able to use it?
No.
That's where the estoppel argument starts.
Oh, okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, it makes
And
sense.
then what do you need to have for estoppel? When will that bar revocation? What do you have to show?
Well, it would be, let's see.
Well, how much did it cost?
Reliance. Wouldn't it be the reliance?
That's what estoppel is. It's detrimental reliance is
Okay.
estoppel. But what do you have to show, right? How will you apply barring the revocation of the license by way of estoppel? What do you have to show to prove estoppel in this case?
I wanna say intent, but I don't think
No.
that's necessary.
Well, I mean, I suppose you could arguably say intent, but what were the things that we talked about?
Well, let's show intent.
Well, the water, the usage of, they need water.
No. Take a step back. Without what their needs are, he invited them on, so they started doing what?
They started doing, maintenance, constructing.
Labor,
Labor,
right? And what else did they do?
well, they put money into it.
Money, right? So they invested money and labor. It could be money or labor, but in this case, they did both, right? So in order to bar the revocation, only when the licensee has invested substantial money and labor, or, well, money or labor or both, in reasonable reliance that the easement, or that the license would continue.
Okay, so in this case, it was substantial.
Right, so when you're painting your picture, you're gonna say, it was very substantial. It was $7,000 in 1906. And the labor that it took to construct the concrete, the building, the structure, everything took significant hours and significant materials, right? It wasn't like a one guy job. It wasn't like laying a slab, right? This was significant. And then as soon as this person bared the benefit of the entire construction of the well, he basically made an attempt to revoke the license. Can he do that?
Well, on this one, they said no. They said that the reason the reasoning is irrigating the ditches, drains, and everything else. The license becomes essential and easement continuing for such length of time under the indication conditions of the person itself.
Well, before we even get into an easement, what else about, don't we just say estoppel applies? Which makes the license what?
Revocable.
No. Irrevocable.
Irrevocable.
Right. It makes it irrevocable at that point because they have invested substantial money and labor, right? And so that's the way to thwart somebody taking advantage. The public policy aspect of this, I know it's shocking that I would talk about public policy because I like structure. The public policy position is you can't take advantage of people and say, okay, yeah, hey, I'm gonna let you guys use this space, you create this well for all of us to use because we don't have access otherwise. And then as soon as they finish it, say, sorry, you're out of luck, get out of here. Though the source of water is on my property now and they have a need for this use, right? So what they basically said was they invested substantial money. You think in 1906 people had $7 grand to drop? How many people could just drop $7 grand out of their pocket now? That's still a lot of money. So in 1906, that was like unimaginable. So this was probably a community effort to do this. And then he basically said, hey, thanks for the work, go. Don't come back on my property, you're not welcome. And a standard rule for a license, he can do that. Unless the exception applies for estoppel. So see that step-by-step process you have to do? You have to identify that there's a license, then give the rule for the license, then give the exception for the license, and then tell me if the exception applies, which then makes the license not freely revocable. Now it's irrevocable because estoppel has been shown.
Okay.
That's what I was saying. You don't want to start with the exception because then it's hard to work backwards.
Uh-huh.
You have to start from the beginning of the story.
Okay.
And you want to paint that picture. These poor people with combined incomes of nothing all put forth the effort of time and labor to build a structure that took a great deal of time and a great deal of materials, and then as soon as they were done, he forced them off property, right? He ejected them from the property without explanation, right? Paint the picture. You definitely want to use your facts in this. So if they tell you they spent 20 days, 14 hours a day on shifts and dug this out by hand, I don't think in 1906 they were using an excavator. So can you imagine how long this took? As a practical matter, step back. How long would it take people in 1906 to dig a well? Right? So paint that picture. This guy's terrible. These people, came out losing fingernails and, beaten up and, yeah.
Fell down the well.
Or the wells collapse.
Yeah, that wasn't that uncommon.
Mm-mm.
And also, how many wells did you have to actually dig? Very easily, this could have been the 3rd or 4th well.
That's true.
Right? They dug dry wells all the time back then.
So really important that you paint that picture and that you go in a chronological fashion with these particular issues.
Well, that makes sense.
Cool. Beautiful. All right, I really love this section of the book because literally the next case, the header above it is creation by implication. So is this an affirmative or a negative easement? Affirmative, why? Because you don't have a creation of implication under negative, right? So, who wants to take Finn versus Williams?
All right, so this is in the Supreme Court of Illinois in 1941, and Charles Williams owned a tract of land consisting of approximately 140 acres. On February 16, 1941, he conveyed 39.47 acres to Thomas Bacon. And then in 1937, the Finns, who are the plaintiffs, acquired the title to this piece of land. The defendant, Zilphia Jane Williams, inherited the remaining 100 acres. The only means of getting to the nearest highway and market from the Finns' land was by crossing over Williams' land. So Williams refused to give the Finns permission to cross over her land, and the Finns brought an action in the circuit court of Sangamon County seeking an easement by necessity. A decree was rendered adjudging the plaintiffs to be the owners of the right-of-way of the easement by necessity over the defendant's 100 acres, and then the defendant's appealing. So the issue I had was, does an implied easement by necessity pass on with a transfer of land? And the rule, 577, where an owner of land conveys a parcel thereof which has no outlet to a highway except over the remaining land of the grantor or over the land of strangers, a way by necessity exists over the remaining land of the grantor. So the court says that an easement by necessity over a conveyor's land is implied where the only available means of ingress and egress to a highway is over the conveyor's land or that of a stranger. Right-of-way easement of necessity was necessarily implied in the conveyance which severed the two tracts of land in 1895 and passed by intermediate conveyances to the plaintiffs in 1937. Although this easement may not have been used by the Finns' predecessors, they have the right to exercise the easement at any time because it passes with each transfer. The subsequent grantees can avail themselves, make use of the dormant easement implied in the deed, severing the dominant and serving it the states. So therefore, because the Finns are exercising their right to utilize the easement by necessity, the court ends up ruling in favor of the Finns, and they affirmed the decree of the circuit court.
Okay, so. Go ahead.
Everyone understand? That's this case.
It's pretty easy, yeah.
It's really, again, they're not hard when you break them down, you know? The short version is they tell you that this guy named Williams, right?
Yeah.
He owned all this land, sells it to this guy. The only way, then the Bacon sells it to Finn, and Finn says, hey, I want to get to town, right? The only way to get there is here. The facts tell you there's no way this way. The facts tell you there's no way this way. They say east and west are both blocked. So the town is up here. Here's the nearest highway to get to the town. Does he have an easement or not? Even though Bacon never even used it. The answer is
Yes.
there you go. That's this case. Excellent. Good job. Everyone's doing a good job tonight. So much easier when they do that, isn't it?
Granite Properties Limited Partnership versus Mans.
I'll try that.
Okay.
This is also Supreme Court of Illinois in 1987. Sorry, the facts are long, so.
Okay, I'm just feeling like I'm digging your Efron beanie with the bangs.
What?
I'm like digging your look. The Efron beanie.
Well,
I'm loving it. I'm loving
I'm
it.
not gonna sing though, so no.
He's not gonna what?
So I'm not gonna sing.
Oh, all right. But can you do the Running Man?
At the end, I'm not gonna do it.
Oh my God.
So
Required.
the facts of the case.
Go ahead.
I'll let you skip the case if you do the damn dance.
Wait, no joke. This happens sometimes. You think that never happens in court? I used a word that was a challenge word in court one day, and the DA told me that if I used it on the record in context, he wouldn't object to my Romero motion, which is a motion to strike a strike prior, which effectively doubles your sentence if you get in trouble again. So if you get a strike crime, it's a violent crime. Let's say you get picked up for something and you've got like a 5-year exposure. You now have a 10-year exposure because of the strike.
Oh, wow.
The word was floxinocine hilopilification. I used it. I won a bird award for it too, but I used it And the DA literally said, we'll submit. The judge granted it, and my client did 30 days on an electronic monitoring instead of going to prison for years. So every once in a while, take advantage of
You
it.
should have done the running.
What was the
down
word?
and saving it.
Classification. It's one of the longest words in the English language, if not the longest. Yeah. It's nice. Anyway, please now.
Yeah, because I actually did this too.
All right.
Okay, so the plaintiff and his predecessors owned parcel B from 1963-1962. Sorry to mistake.
Okay.
It was then conveyed by warranty deed to the defendants, and the plaintiff currently owns parcel A and parcel E, which are on opposite sides of each other and are adjacent to parcel B, and parcel B remains undeveloped.
You see why they put a picture in this case?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really hard to look at it. So on parcel A is situated a shopping center, and the rear of the center is used for deliveries, trash, storage, removal, and utilities repair. And to gain access to the rear, trucks use a gravel driveway which runs along the lot line between parcel A and parcel B. And parcel E is situated in an apartment complex with a parking lot. The only access to a parking lot is a driveway that cuts across a small panhandle on the western corner of parcel B. And this has been existing since the complex was constructed. They said that building a driveway for entering and exiting towards Prairie Street would be dangerous since it would be built near stairways leading to the basement apartments. Each driveway from parcel B and into each building structure situated in parcels A and E provide access to each area before parcel B was even conveyed to defendants. Nan's defendant have since prevented the plaintiff from using and enjoyment of these two claim easements. So the plaintiff granted properties brought suit in the circuit court following bench trial entered judgment against them and in favor of the defendants as to both claim easements. Following the plaintiff's post-trial motion, the circuit court granted permanent injunctive relief for easement for the apartment complex, but not for the shopping district. Both parties appealed, and the court held that the plaintiff was entitled to both easements. And so the defendant appealed the decision to the Supreme Court. So the issue before us is that can a conveyor of land retain an implied easement over gravel driveways on the land that he has continued to use for years if it was not expressly reserved in the conveyance? So this is where the court introduced two different type of easement by necessity and easement implied from a pre-existing use. And so the for the rule I took from the book on page 584, it said there are three proofs required for an easement implied from pre-existing use. First, common ownership, their claim dominant and subservient parcels, and a subsequent conveyance or transfer separating that ownership. Second, before the conveyance or transfer serving the unique title, the common owner used part of the united parcel for the benefit of another part, and this was apparent, obvious, continuous, and permanent. And third, the claimed easement is necessary and beneficial to employment of the parcel conveyed or retained by the grantor or transferor. So firstly, the court acknowledged that driveways have been used by the plaintiff's or predecessors in title since 1960s, when the respective properties were developed and driveways were permanent in character. And said the defendants were aware of the driveways prior use before they purchased parcel B, which would tend to support an inference that the parties intended easements upon surface of the parcels in question. They also disagreed with the defendant's necessity requirement. They said that when circumstances such as an apparent prior use of the land support the inference of the party's intention, the required extent of claimed easement's necessity will be less than when necessity is the only circumstances from which the inference potential will be drawn. I don't know where they were going with the elastic necessity requirement herself, so they said necessity was not a strong argument in their part.
Do you think you don't argue it if it's not a great argument?
No.
No, you argue it, right?
Yep.
You argue everything you can.
Okay.
Even if it's not, it's kind of like, let me give you this example. So when I was in law school and I was in criminal procedure, I got the lowest grade on the midterm and I got the highest grade on the final. Because I didn't get at the time of the midterm, the professor met with me and he said, well, what did you think about this issue? And I told him and he said, none of that is in your paper. And I said, yeah, because it doesn't apply. And he said, why wouldn't you talk about it? 3 of the 4 elements applied, and I said, yeah, but I found that 4th didn't, so it didn't apply.
No.
And he said, but I don't know that you knew that because it's not in the paper, right?
Yeah.
Just like a judge might not know that that's a potential viable argument if you don't put it in your pleadings.
Mm.
So you have to at least bring the cause of action. Now, don't like frivolously argue certain things if you know that they aren't going to work, but if there is a arguable issue, put it on there. It's arguable for a reason, especially in a law school exam. We put it on there because we want you to argue it. It's a gray area, you must argue it, right? So that's why they talk about this. Even though it's not a strong argument, it is a viable argument that they can make. Don't try and crowbar in every single one of these or something, but if you're looking at something where you're saying, gosh, that kind of looks like this, and you probably want to discuss it, then you can, dismiss it after you've given us the explanation and the analysis.
And I guess to tie it off, I think that's where I was going. It said, given the strong evidence of the plaintiff's prior use of the driveways in question and the defendant's knowledge thereof, the appellate court's majority decision that the evidence in this case was sufficient to fulfill, once again, the last strict necessity requirement.
Okay.
I understand that part.
So what do we learn from this case? What section is it under?
Implied,
It's a good start.
Right?
yeah.
Still under implied easements, right? So this, not a great example of an easement by necessity, but good example of an easement by implication. What's the rule for easement by implication? The use must have been, the prior use must have been what?
Was apparent and.
Was apparent and?
Parties expected for it to live on.
Right, they intended for it to survive. Is that what we had here?
Yeah, well, and then the other viable options for the plaintiff was that it's too much effort to change the way he was already doing it, and.
Yeah, he did. He made that argument. That's true. But let me just ask you, just to show you kind of the difference. Okay, remember, we have to start with one other thing. Remember, this is commercial now. So it's a little different. Okay, it just is, all right? How you use your own private land, for personal, purposes is much different than you would in a commercial setting. So it's a little different, just so you know. Okay, so because in private, residences and things like that, and property cases we've seen before, where there's no real business going on, necessity really means necessity. All right, it's got to be no other way to get it. Not so much in commercial. But wouldn't you say to yourself, well, first of all, there's 2 arguments that would argue for finding it by implication, as opposed, but prior use, as opposed to necessity, which again, in this situation, you would at least argue it because it's commercial. So commercial necessity may be very different than I'm just landlocked and can't get the hell out of here, right? That's very different because that's not going to happen very often, right? How often you buy a building and it's landlocked? Think about it, that never happens. So commercial is somewhat different analysis. But first of all, let's look at necessity. Is it really a necessity that he used those easements to run his business? Yes or no? Is it a necessity? Yes or no? No other way, not possible. No way to do this if I can't use these 2 places. I'm landlocked, I'm done. No, there's another way to do it. We already know that. They say it right in the case, right? They say this just happens to be what? The best way, the easiest way, the quickest way. And why do we know that? Partly because of the totality of the circumstances, right? We can look at the land. And partly because of what? Think, just common sense, doesn't have to be real property. Because that's the way the guy before me used it.
Okay.
Now, when he paid the price for this land, be it commercial or private, do you think that the price reflected the easier use of the easements that you could easily see as you walked around? So absent a provision that says, oh, by the way, I need you to give these up, right? If you sign it, you sign it. That's your call, right? Is there any such document in this? Do you think the price reflected the idea that you would be able to use these easements as opposed to using the one that was more difficult, therefore more costly? Almost for sure, I would say. Is that all true, what I just said? Everyone understand? Let's move on. Good job. I mean, that's probably the most sophisticated part of it, because it sounds like necessity, but see, it's really not. You know? Now, if you didn't have the prior use argument, what else you got left? See, that's why you gotta bring these things up. Because in commercial setting, maybe, right? Because, you know, commercial's all about money. Hey. Yes? Okay. They're really quiet tonight.
Would you have any objection
No.
to skipping the creation by prescription section since we've done 2 weeks on adverse possession? Okay, it's just like adverse possession without exclusivity.
The only difference is that common law, it took 30 years. What's the time? 3-0, so it was a little bit longer. Modernly, it's mostly 7 in most states.
That is for a prescriptive easement, not for an adverse possession.
Right.
Okay.
Prescriptive ease.
Does anybody have any questions about those 2 cases?
Otherwise, they're just the same.
I didn't see any like darting stares across the room like. Okay, so that takes us to scope and transferability on page 603. SS Kresge Company versus Winkleman Realty Company. Don't you love some of the names? Like it's never Smith versus Jones, right? I mean, every once in a while it's Smith versus Jones, but it's way more fun this way.
I used to work in a famous building in downtown LA for a little while. Look it up online, you'll find pictures of it. It was called Nate Starkman and Son. Nate died, I don't know, 100 years ago or so, but they kept the name on the building.
There you go.
Kind of cool, huh?
All right, who's got
Nate Starkman.
the case under scope and transferability? Don't all jump at once, but the faster you do this, the faster we go home, right? Well, the faster you go home, I'm staying. Go ahead.
Okay, so is it Kresge?
Uh-huh.
Kresge versus Winkleman. So the plaintiff, I had to draw it out. The plaintiff owns lots 5 and 6, and the defendant owns lots 2, 3, and 4. On the plaintiff's land, there's an 11 and 1/2 feet alleyway.
That's in front. That's really close. That's good. Only got one side came backwards. Really good. And it doesn't matter. That's the whole thing. Very good. This is not an easy case to actually map out.
The plaintiff's land, there's an 11 and 1/2 feet alleyway. Prior to Winkleman Realty Company, which is the defendant, owning the property, it belonged to Max Tisch. Tisch had a plumbing business owned lot 2 and the west portion of lot 3, which was previously a barber shop, and the upper half were living quarters. In 1936, the plaintiff tried to close the alleyway, and Tisch was allowed his easement for ingress and egress from the alleyway. Defendants purchased Tisch's property along with the 1943 easement, and the defendants began to use the alleyway for storage of goods and transport of the goods to their various stores. They had department stores and appliance stores. The plaintiff is looking to limit the easement to ingress and egress, which was the use of the easement of the previous owners. Plaintiff is also looking to enjoin the defendant from transporting merchandise to or from their men's store or department store. There's a lot going on procedurally. It says the trial court found that the easement acquired by defendant from Tisch's property is only appurtenant to that lot and not any other lot owned by the defendant. They also found that the defendant was using the alleyway for purposes other than what the original easement prescribed, and that additional use was an additional burden on the plaintiff's Serbian estate. The trial court quieted titles to the alleyway in favor of plaintiff, but recognized the original Tisch easement in favor of defendant, but it ordered that the defendants not use the alleyway in any manner not permitted under the Tisch easement. So the defendants appealed, and then the plaintiffs appealed for a modification of the decree to prevent the defendant from any usage of the alleyway. So as my issue, I have, can an easement for one purpose be used for additional and subsequent usage and still be valid? I have here, the original easement was for a barber shop and living quarters. In this case, the defendants have greatly changed the usage of the use of the dominant estate because they use it as a retail outlet for appliances and as a storage warehouse for other merchandise that is not going to be sold on the premises. The defendants argued that they had not unreasonably burdened the plaintiff. In case Lindekin v. Paulson, the court said that one does not have to wait until they are unreasonably burdened, but may proceed when any additional burden is placed upon his property and whenever the defendants improperly attempt to increase their rights under the easement. From my rule, I have it on page 604 towards the bottom. A prescriptive right acquired by a particular use of the property cannot ordinarily justify an added use in connection with the dominant estate in a manner far different from that employed under the original use. So the judgment was affirmed.
Very good reading in that case. It's actually a pretty hard case. Believe it or not, that's what it looks like. And she got one number wrong. Like good.
That makes more sense now.
Yeah, I did that too. It's funny because I remember doing that the first time I ever mapped it out. I said, wait, that doesn't make sense. And it's like, so yeah, that's a little bit, because I mean, our judge is always clear about such things. Sometimes you'll go, well, what about the southwest corner? And there's nothing in there. Drives you crazy, actually. Explains all my gray hair. Judges. Anyways, that's what this case looks like. You got the facts right. So if you kind of look at it and see where you're trying to do, yeah. So what do you think? I mean, is this a good one for scope and transferability? Absolutely. Good job. Very good. This is a hard one. This one took me a couple of stabs at figuring out what they were arguing about. So, good job.
Okay, Sikansky versus Wayne. Okay.
All right, so Sikansky is the plaintiff. Oh, this is in the Supreme Court of New Hampshire, by the way. Sikansky.
I mean, I literally see certain states and I'm like, he's gonna choose that one.
It's East Coast.
You're like our East Coast representative here, I get it.
For sure.
Alright.
So Sikansky owned a parcel of land accessed by an easement across the property owned by the defendant. The easement was established by deed, and there were buildings on the land, and the defendant wanted to construct a building over the location of the easement. I think the easement was like 18 feet in width. It doesn't much matter though. So he wanted to construct a building over the location of the easement and offered to leave a gap between the buildings, allowing 8 feet of headroom for vehicles to pass under. So Wayne also offered to construct new access to Sikansky's property that detoured around the proposed new buildings. So Sikansky petitioned for an injunction to, not allow the construction of a new building across the easement way. So the trial court heard the evidence of the proposed new easement way, and they concluded that the defendant's proposed reduction in height of the old right-of-way wasn't unreasonable with the plaintiff's rights. The trial court also said that the 8-foot height limit would be an unreasonable obstruction if the court weren't allowed to consider a proposed alternative route. So Sikansky petitioned to the Supreme Court for review of the admissibility of the evidence related to the proposed new easement and to give a further determination of Sikansky's entitlement to an injunction. So the issue I have is, may the defendants build over the right of way by limiting the height of the right of way to 8 feet? And the rule that New Hampshire follows is the rule of reason, which says that a question of fact is to be determined by consideration of all the surrounding circumstances, including the location and use of both dominant and servient estates, and taking into consideration the advantage to be derived by one and the disadvantage to be suffered by the other owner. So, an easement holder has an absolute right to use the land located within the easement way. A dominant estate holder has no right to demand that a serving estate holder provide access over any part of the serving estate other than the area that's subject to the easement. And on the adverse side of that, a serving estate holder has no right to demand that a dominant estate holder use any portion of the serving estate other than the area subject to the easement. The rule of reason is used in New Hampshire to determine the rights of the owners of dominant serving estates when those rights aren't otherwise specified by an agreement between the parties. So the rule really prohibits the unreasonable expansion of the rights of a dominant estate holder and prohibits the serving estate owner from establishing an unreasonable burden upon the dominant estate. And then they really look at the reasonableness and they say that the the trial court applied the rule of reason to conclude that Sikansky has the right to be able to access the rear of the premises for vehicles over 8 feet tall. And Sikansky has the absolute right to use the easement as long as it's within reason. So evidence related to the proposed new easement way is immaterial to determining what constitutes reasonable use by Sikansky. And Wayne's required to provide more clearance for the continuation of Sikansky's reasonable use of the easement. So they dismissed the case.
Pretty much. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. If you read the deed, right, you get the scope. So that's what we're looking at. Now, there's basically a short version. They're trying to, he doesn't want anything to block the easement, right? That's basically the bottom line. This guy wants to build and he doesn't want to, he doesn't want to give up the easement, he wants it. And so the builder is trying to be tricky, all right? And he has two options. So you see that's sort of outlay, that thing that you see there, that sort of looks like this. What's the first option? Go away, build around it. Just leave my easement away. But he doesn't want to do that. So this bright young entrepreneurial builder wants to do what? Wants to build over it. He says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to build over it. So theoretically, if you read the case, if I'm reading it correctly, what he's going to be doing is building a building. It basically looks like this. And then there's the easement, whatever he's trying to do, right? And so he says, I'll give you 8 feet. What did the owner of the easement say? It's not enough. Where'd you get 8 feet from? Yeah. And he said 8 feet should be enough. And his answer was what? Says who? So they go to court. What did the court say? What about 8 feet? Is it reasonable? Don't know. Go back and figure it out. You haven't given us any evidence. It sounds good to me. Is it reasonable? See you again next year. Is that this case? Move on. So scope includes what? Not just this here, but it's here, here. It's just everything's dependent on what?
Reasonableness.
Reasonableness, and how do you determine the reasonableness of an easement? We've been saying this all night, by the
Scope.
But how do you determine the scope that it would be reasonable? If it's not written down, what do?
Let the trier of fact decide.
Just look at the totality of the situation. That's the only way you can do it with easements. There's no other way. There's no rules. You see what I'm saying? There's nothing that says, yeah, an easement can never be more than 8 feet. There's no such thing. Got it? That's why I draw these out, because like I said, you have to look at the situation, otherwise you will not understand why they're doing what they do. If we knew what they were really thinking, that would be one thing. But with easements, that's because things change so much, because, you gotta look at the totality of the situation. What would a reasonable person think would have been fair? The time he gave it, probably 8 feet would have been great, right? They probably had a horse and a wagon back then. Today, how many trucks do you know that are 8 feet high? That little tiny truck. You know what I'm saying?
Ford Ranger.
And then you look at the situation. Do you, yeah, exactly. Or it's like my friend bought one of those smart cars and I said, where's the other half of your car? He got mad at me. Anyway, so you see how I guess it depends if you like real property or not. But that's why easements are so interesting, because you really have to look at everything and then break it down. Is it this, and this, right? If you wonder, was it created? What's the scope? How or did it end? And then you got your zombie ones, which are really interesting too.
Zombie.
Okay, we good? Okay, moving on.
Okay, who's gonna like me very much for the next case? Everybody should raise their hand because I'm going to focus your attention to the last full paragraph of 613. Well, the paragraph above that and that paragraph. Abandonment is a question of intention. Okay? Can it be of intention alone? No, not necessarily. Can non-use create abandonment?
No.
No, right? What must you have? A demonstration by what? Physical action. The intent to never use the easement again. So intent coupled with the physical action to abandon. Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
You have anything to add, Professor Drucker?
Hell no.
All right. Hell no, we want to go, right? Okay. We're having a good time with this. I think that's pretty fair. I think you guys get the concept of abandonment. Intention coupled with physical action. Cannot be intention alone. I suppose could be physical action and then implied intention.
Yeah, it can be that, there's case law.
Okay, anybody have any questions? Everybody's had a little mushy because it was a lot of information at once, but good information, structured information, not rule against perpetuities, right?
Just remember when you get it, if you should get an easement question in this class or on the bar, just go through what Professor AJ pointed out. That's just what you do. That's just the way we do easements. We just can't lose.
All right, have a lovely evening, everyone. We will see you again next week, and not for too many weeks thereafter. Okay, it's a home stretch, folks.
Amazing. Huh?
Just gotta make it through a few more weeks.
Here, you have a long drive. You can put your-
Yeah, a couple seconds.
What's up? Whoa, wait, you had one other thing to do before the end of class.
Yeah.
What do you mean? We forgot.
Oh,
You
yeah.
agree?
I don't recall.
You don't have any independent recollection?
No.
Alright, that's the way you wanna play it. How many participation points do you lose for not really running that? I'm
I never agreed.
not gonna hold you hostage.
You know, you gotta think to yourself though.
I don't think it was a request.
We're sitting there going,
I'm
I'm sitting there saying 65 or 70.
No, I actually really like it. It looks very
Thank
nice. It just like gave me like Efron-esque, like,
You know he's got a full beard now.
what?
Yeah.
He looks
He's trying to look like a man. Right? Does it? She really likes to do it. She's like,
I showed it to her and she's like,
Oh, these are the German panels.
If I had absolutely any idea what you guys were talking about, I'm sure that would be much more interesting.
That's a movie
It
star.
kind of reminds me of the Sharpie pencil, but the tips are a little shorter and the pen is wider. I think it's the narrowness of the pen.
Oh, that's what I like.
Oh, yeah.
And the Japanese case, that's our.
Oh, I've seen those, yeah, I really liked the case, but I didn't like the pen. And then I knew if I lost one of the pens, I was gonna have a hard time.
Well, at Barnes and Noble, they tell me.
Oh, really? I was gonna have a little OCD issue with,
I missed the blue and I'm like,
with one of them missing.
If I was coordinated enough, I would do it. What is it?
so what is it?
They go like this, they go.
Good luck.
No, I had to suffer through my nephews this weekend. Think about that, 22 and 24.
it's not a bad
They
age.
think they know everything.
Oh, yeah. Does it evaluate
Those 20-year-olds.
The age of invincibility.
Yeah.
Outlook, entitled
Well, it's
kids
not,
there.
not even entitled, it's just they think that everything I know is wrong. It's like, why don't I even say anything? It's like, well, that used to be true.
Have they gone to college?
Yeah.
Is that what they- yeah,
Well,
that's-
what but way worse. Like, Santa Cruz. Oh, of course, he knows everything under the sun, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, you're from the generation that we almost choked to death on your oil. I don't listen to you. How dare you?
No.
I had to talk to my sister. This goddamn good American oil. Watch yourself, son.
You remember, you remember, what's his name? Bobby Brown?
Yeah, Bobby Brown.
You mean, Whitney Houston stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, he was
That's
Bobby
what,
Brown before.
I know.
Okay.
Will Smith too, let's say Bobby Brown.
Yeah, Will Smith did it,
And
but
he's
Bobby
American.
Brown did it, and
I
so
don't know how to do it.
and
I
Cat,
lied.
what was that guy's name?
Cat Williams?
Cat Williams, he did it a lot too.
The running man.
The running man. Oh,
Really
he
good.
did really good. He was Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do it.
But he's funny. He's
Uh-huh.
He's funny.
I think I have
He
a,
has a
an
nice
idea
on
of this
that,
already.
He was on that.
It looks like they're running backwards.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Is that okay?
No, excuse you.
Yeah.
Love
And
Well, they'll listen it.
Oh,
How you doing?
it.